Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. There's something about the woods at night that stirs a feeling inside you, something primal. Something that reminds you that, no matter how advanced we think we are, we're still just visitors in places like these. I never thought much about it before that night. The night that changed everything. The night I stopped feeling safe in the dark. It was late October, the air crisp enough to see your breath, but not yet biting. My friend and I had been planning a camping trip for weeks, eager to get out of the city and just breathe for a while. I needed it more than anything. Work had been dragging me down, the same routine, the same deadlines, the same mind-numbing stress. So when my friend suggested we head out to a secluded area deep in the forest, I agreed without hesitation. We packed light, just the essentials. A tent, sleeping bags, a couple of flashlights, a portable stove, and enough food to last us the weekend. The spot we had in mind wasn't an official campsite. It was one of those places you hear about from someone who heard about it from someone else. No crowds, no noise, just us and nature, my friend had said. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive took us nearly 3 hours. The first 2 were easy, just long stretches of highway, the hum of the engine filling the silence between our occasional conversations. But the last hour was different. The road narrowed, the trees pressed in on both sides, and the sunlight barely touched the ground. By the time we reached the trailhead, the shadows had already started to stretch. We parked the car at the edge of the dirt path, grabbed our gear, and started walking. The trail wasn't well marked, but my friend insisted he knew where he was going. The trees stood tall, their trunks thick and gnarled. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every twig snapping under your feet, every gust of wind rustling through the leaves. It wasn't eerie, not yet. It was just still. We walked for nearly an hour before finding the perfect spot. A small clearing, just big enough for our tent, surrounded by dense trees. There was a small stream nearby, the kind that barely made a sound as it trickled over the rocks. The ground was firm. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. We set up camp quickly, the routine familiar: unpack, pitch the tent, lay out the sleeping bags. By the time we were done, the sun had slipped behind the trees, leaving behind nothing but a dull glow in the sky. We sat by the fire, warming our hands, talking about nothing in particular. Work, old memories, plans that probably wouldn't happen, but were fun to talk about anyway. The kind of conversation that only happens when you're away from everything else, when there's nothing to distract you. At some point, I glanced at my watch. 11:23 p.m. The fire had burned low, flickering weakly against the dark. I stood up, stretching, my muscles aching from the hike. My friend yawned, rubbing his eyes. "I think I'm gonna turn in," he said, crawling into the tent without another word. I stayed up a little longer, staring into the embers, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was different at night. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, pressing against me like a weight. Every now and then, I thought I heard something beyond the trees. A branch snapping. A rustling that didn't match the wind. Probably just an animal. Probably nothing. Still, I felt uneasy, like something was watching. I shook the feeling off, doused the fire, and crawled into the tent. The sleeping bag was warm, the fabric rough against my skin. My friend was already asleep, his breathing slow and steady. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the night fill the space around me. The wind through the trees, the distant sound of water, the occasional creak of a branch. Then, just as I started to drift off, something changed. The wind stopped. The trees went still. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. No rustling, no chirping, no movement, just nothing. And in that nothingness, I heard it. A sound. Faint, distant. Something that didn't belong. A low, rhythmic tapping. Steady, deliberate. Coming from the woods. And getting closer. The tapping continued. Soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the normal sounds of the forest. But the more I focused, the more unnatural it felt. It wasn't random like the wind knocking a branch against a tree. It was deliberate, steady, like something or someone was doing it on purpose. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound would stop for a moment, then start again. 4 taps. A pause. 4 more. I turned my head toward my friend. His breathing was deep and even. He was still asleep. I wanted to wake him, to ask if he heard it too, but I hesitated. If I woke him up over some sound in the woods, he'd just roll his eyes and tell me to go back to sleep. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself, squeezed my eyes shut, and tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the woods were full of weird noises, that I was being paranoid. Then it happened again. Tap, 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 tap. Closer this time. I opened my eyes. My heart was beating faster now, the unease creeping through me like cold fingers. I turned my head slightly toward the entrance of the tent. The fabric was zipped shut, but I could see the faint glow of the dying fire filtering through. I listened. Nothing. For a long moment, there was only silence. No wind, no rustling, no tapping. I let out a slow breath, telling myself that whatever it was gone. Maybe it had been a branch shifting in the breeze. Maybe. Tap, 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 tap. I sat up. This time, it wasn't coming from the distance. It was right outside the tent. My chest tightened. My mouth went dry. My hands, still inside the sleeping bag, balled into fists. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The fire outside was low, casting just enough light to make out vague shadows on the tent fabric. I watched for movement, expecting to see something shift, but the shadows remained still. The tapping didn't come again. I sat like that for what felt like forever, heart hammering, ears straining. Minutes passed, maybe more. The silence stretched on, heavy and unnatural. Eventually, I convinced myself that whatever it was, an animal, a tree creaking, my imagination, it was over. I forced myself to lie back down, staring at the ceiling of the tent, trying to will myself to relax. I repeated in my head that it was nothing, that I was overreacting, that I was safe. Somehow, at some point, I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my friend unzipping the tent. Sunlight streamed in, warm and golden, chasing away the eerie feeling from the night before. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. My body felt stiff, my head foggy. "Man, you were out," my friend said, stretching. "I got up like an hour ago and let you sleep." I blinked at him. "Did you hear anything last night?" He frowned. "Like what?" I hesitated. I didn't want to sound crazy. Tapping. Like a knocking sound outside the tent. He gave me a weird look. "No, I slept fine. Probably just an animal." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But something about the sound felt too controlled, too precise to be random. Still, I didn't argue. We stepped out of the tent, and I stretched my arms over my head, shaking off the tension in my muscles. The forest looked normal in the daylight. Peaceful, even. Birds chirped, the leaves rustled in the breeze, the stream nearby gurgled softly. Nothing felt out of place. For a moment, I almost laughed at myself. Maybe I really had imagined it. Then I saw them. 4 marks in the dirt, right outside the tent. They were shallow, like someone or something had pressed a stick or a finger into the soil in 4 distinct places. 4. Just like the tapping. A chill ran down my spine. I stared at the marks, my throat suddenly dry. "Hey," I called out. My friend was by the fire pit, poking at the ashes from last night. He glanced up. "What's up?" I pointed at the ground. "Did you do this?" He walked over, squinting down at the marks. He frowned. "No, what is that?" I swallowed. "I don't know." We stood there for a long moment, just staring. Finally, he shook his head. "Probably nothing. Maybe you kicked the dirt in your sleep or something." But that didn't make sense. The marks were too precise, too intentional. I didn't argue though. I just nodded, pretending to brush it off. Still, the feeling of unease didn't go away. It lingered, crawling under my skin like an itch I couldn't scratch. I forced myself to push it out of my mind. We had the whole day ahead of us, and I wasn't going to let some weird marks in the dirt ruin the trip. But as we packed up our things and started preparing breakfast, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been outside our tent last night, watching, listening, and knocking. The day passed uneventfully, or at least, that's what I tried to tell myself. We went about our plans, hiking through the dense trails, fishing in the stream, and talking about random things to keep our minds off the previous night. The morning light had made it easy to dismiss the tapping and the strange marks outside the tent. Maybe it really was just an animal. Maybe I had imagined how precise the sounds were. But the nagging feeling in my gut never completely left. The woods felt different. The stillness was off. At first, I didn't notice it. Not when we were busy walking or talking. But during the quieter moments, when we stopped to take a break, when we were standing by the water, when we sat in silence, it became obvious. The forest wasn't as loud as it should have been. Birds chirped, but not constantly. The wind rustled the trees, but there were long pauses of unnatural stillness. The sounds that normally filled the background of the woods, the distant scurrying of small animals, the buzzing of insects, the occasional snapping of twigs, felt inconsistent, like something was keeping them away. Like the forest was holding its breath. By late afternoon, we made our way back to camp. The sun had started its slow descent, casting long shadows across the ground. As we approached, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. Something was wrong. I slowed my pace. My friend noticed and shot me a look. "You good?" I nodded, but my eyes were locked on the campsite. Everything was exactly where we left it. The tent stood in the same spot. The fire pit was undisturbed, and our backpacks rested against a log. But it felt different. Oof! Like someone had been here. I scanned the area, searching for something out of place. My gut was telling me something had changed, but I couldn't put my finger on what. My friend didn't seem bothered. He dropped his bag and stretched. "Man, I'm starving. Let's get a fire going." I nodded absently, still scanning the area. My eyes landed on the tent. The zipper. It was open an inch. I stopped breathing for a second. I knew for a fact we had zipped it up all the way when we left. I took a step closer, my pulse picking up. The gap was small, but noticeable. Just enough for someone to peek inside. I turned to my friend. "Did you open the tent before we left?" He gave me a confused look. "Know why?" I pointed. His eyes followed my gesture, and I saw the confusion shift into something else. Something more serious. "Maybe we didn't zip it all the way," he offered, but there was hesitation in his voice. I shook my head. "We did. I remember checking before we left." A beat of silence passed between us. Then, without a word, I stepped forward and slowly pulled the zipper down. The sound was loud in the quiet. I hesitated before reaching for the flap, then threw it open in one quick motion. The inside looked normal. Sleeping bags, backpacks, a couple of flashlights. Nothing out of place. I let out a slow breath, but the unease didn't fade. My friend exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Dude, you're making me paranoid." "It's fine. Maybe the wind moved it or something." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But the air inside the tent smelled different. It didn't smell like us. There was something faint, something hard to describe. It wasn't exactly a bad smell, but it wasn't normal either. Like damp earth. Like something that had been sitting in the woods for too long. I backed away, letting the tent flap fall. "Let's just get the fire going," I muttered. As the sun dipped lower, we set up for the night. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I felt a little better with the flames between us and the darkening forest, but the unease never fully went away. We ate, talked, and tried to act like nothing was wrong. But every few minutes, my eyes would drift back to the tree line. The woods felt like they were watching. Eventually, night swallowed the campsite. The fire was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, and we sat in its glow, listening to the occasional pop of burning wood. Then, the sound came again. Tap, 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 tap. I froze. My friend did too. The sound was distant this time, somewhere past the trees. He turned his head toward me, his face illuminated by the firelight. "Tell me you heard that." I nodded slowly. We sat in tense silence, waiting. Then, tap, 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 tap. Closer. My friend grabbed the flashlight and stood up, shining the beam toward the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet, shifting shadows of the forest. His voice was tight. Maybe a woodpecker? I swallowed hard. At night, the tapping stopped. Silence! Then, in the distance, a branch snapped. I shot to my feet. That wasn't an animal. It wasn't some random sound. That was a footstep. Someone, or something, was out there. My friend tightened his grip on the flashlight. "Hello," he called. The woods didn't answer. Then, just barely loud enough to hear, tap, 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 tap. My stomach turned to ice. It was right at the edge of the firelight. He swung the flashlight wildly, the beam bouncing off the trees. Shadows shifted, stretched, and moved. Then the beam landed on something. I sucked in a sharp breath. There, between the trees, a shape. It was just beyond the reach of the firelight, standing completely still. Tall, too tall, not moving, not breathing. My friend saw it too. He went rigid, gripping my arm. Then, it stepped back. The flashlight flickered. The figure melted into the darkness, swallowed by the trees. "Gone!" My friend turned to me, eyes wide, breath shaky. "We're leaving. Now." I didn't argue. We moved fast, shoving what we could into our bags, leaving the rest behind. The fire was still burning, but we didn't care. As we turned to go, I stole one last glance at the tree line. And I swear, right where the figure had been, I saw 4 marks in the dirt. We didn't waste time. With the fire still burning, we grabbed whatever we could carry, throwing essentials into our backpacks. The rest didn't matter. The tent, the sleeping bags, even the fishing gear, none of it was worth staying a second longer. My friend's hands were shaking as he zipped his bag. "I don't care if it's a 3-hour hike back, we're getting out of here. Now." I nodded, my throat too dry to respond. The woods had gone silent again. No wind, no insects, just the sound of our own frantic breathing. I slung my bag over my shoulder and turned toward the path leading out of the campsite. My friend flicked on his flashlight, scanning the trees one last time. Then he froze. The beam caught something. A handprint, pressed against the bark of a tree at the edge of the clearing. It was high, too high for a person. And worse, it wasn't normal. The fingers were too long. The shape was off. And the longer I stared, the more I realized. The fingers weren't spread out like someone had casually placed their hand there. They were pressed together, firm, deliberate, like whatever made it had been watching us. We bolted. The fire crackled behind us as we ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the dark. The trail was rough, and our feet slipped on loose dirt, but we didn't slow down. Branches clawed at our arms. Twigs snapped beneath our boots. The air was thick, heavy, pressing in from all sides. We just had to keep moving. The tapping sound returned. Tap, 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 tap. It was following us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I turned my head, I knew it'd see something I didn't want to see. My friend was ahead of me, breathing hard, flashlight swinging wildly. The path twisted through the trees, narrowing as we went. I had no idea how far we'd made it, how much longer until we reached the car, but it wasn't fast enough. Then, a flash of movement. Right off the path, in the corner of my eye. Something huge. Something wrong. It was keeping pace with us. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I forced myself to move faster. The tapping sound shifted, no longer behind us, but beside us, keeping time with our footsteps. Tap, 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 tap. Then, my friend screamed. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even a full sound, just a raw, choked out noise of terror. The flashlight dropped, tumbling onto the dirt, the beam flipping wildly. I turned my head, and I saw it. It was standing just beyond the tree line, close enough to make out the shape. Tall, too tall. Its limbs were thin, elongated, stretched in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its head was tilted slightly, as if studying us. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach twist and my vision blur, it had no face, no eyes, no mouth, no features. Just smooth, stretched skin where a face should be. The tapping sound came again, but this time, I realized where it was coming from. Not from its hands. From its neck. A slow, rhythmic sound, like something shifting beneath the skin. Like something trying to speak. Then it moved. Not stepped. Not ran. It just shifted. One moment it was still. The next, it was closer. Too close. My body finally caught up with my brain. I ran. I grabbed my friend, pulling him with me, barely registering the fact that his legs had nearly given out beneath him. He was shaking, breath coming in short, broken gasps. We sprinted. Branches snapped behind us. The tapping sound was everywhere. Then, up ahead, the car. I didn't think, just lunged forward, fumbling with the keys in my pocket. My fingers barely worked. My chest was so tight it felt like my ribs were caving in. I unlocked the doors, shoved my friend inside, and practically threw myself into the driver's seat. The moment the doors slammed shut, the sound stopped. No more tapping. No more movement. Just silence. I fumbled to start the car, my hands still shaking violently. The headlights flicked on, flooding the trees in harsh white light. And for a second, I swore I saw it, standing just beyond the reach of the beams. Motionless. Watching. Waiting. The engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the road, leaving the woods and whatever was in them behind. But even as we drove, even as the campsite disappeared in the rearview mirror, I swear I could still hear it. Faint. Distant. Tap, 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 tap. We didn't stop driving. The road twisted and turned through the mountains, pitch black except for the headlights cutting through the night. My hands were locked on the wheel, knuckles white, my foot pressing the gas pedal harder than I should have. But I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Beside me, my friend was dead silent. He hadn't spoken since we got in the car, just sat there, staring straight ahead. His breathing was uneven, his hands curled into fists in his lap. I wanted to say something, to ask if he saw what I saw, but I wasn't sure I wanted the answer, because if he confirmed it, if he told me, yes, he did see something standing there in the woods, that would make it real. An hour passed before I finally slowed down. We had made it back to the main road, a familiar highway that would take us home. I felt a little safer with streetlights and the occasional car passing by. The world felt normal again. No endless trees, no unnatural silence pressing in from all sides. But the feeling hadn't left me. That sick, crawling sensation at the base of my skull, like we were still being watched. I swallowed hard and glanced in the rearview mirror. Just darkness behind us. An empty road. I forced myself to breathe. Then, my friend spoke for the first time. What the hell was that? His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. I didn't answer right away, because I didn't know. I kept my eyes on the road. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I don't know, I finally said. But even as I spoke the words, I felt like I was lying. Because I did know. I saw it. I saw it standing there, just beyond the trees. I saw the way it moved. I heard the tapping sound, the slow, deliberate rhythm, like something trying to communicate. I saw the face, or lack of one. And I knew, deep down, that whatever it was, it wasn't human. Neither of us slept that night. When we finally made it home, we sat in my living room, lights on, doors locked, too shaken to do anything else. We didn't talk about it. Didn't try to explain it. We just sat there, both of us running over the events in our heads, trying to convince ourselves it wasn't real. That we were just tired. That our minds were playing tricks on us. That we didn't actually see what we saw. But the next morning, when I went to unpack my bag, I found something that made my stomach drop. A handprint, right there, on the side of my backpack. Pressed into the fabric like something had grabbed it. And the shape was wrong. The fingers were too long, too stretched, too familiar. I didn't go back to the woods after that night. I told myself I wouldn't, and I meant it. Whatever was out there, whatever we saw, I wanted no part of it. For weeks, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. That faceless shape standing among the trees. The unnatural length of its limbs. The way it didn't walk, didn't move like anything he had ever seen before, just shifted, like reality itself was bending around it. And the sound, that tapping, tap, 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 tap. Some nights, when the house was quiet, I swore I still heard it. Just faintly, like it was somewhere just beyond my reach. Waiting. My friend refused to talk about it. Anytime I brought it up, he'd shake his head and shut me down. It was nothing, he'd say, his voice tight. Just our minds playing tricks on us. But I could tell he didn't believe it. I could see it in his eyes, the same restless fear I had. The same knowledge that we had seen something, that it was real, and that it had followed us. I thought maybe, with time, it would fade, that the fear would loosen its grip on me, and it'd go back to normal. But then, a month later, my friend called me in the middle of the night. His voice was shaking. I heard it, he whispered, outside my window. I didn't need to ask what he meant. The tapping sound, slow, rhythmic, coming from somewhere just beyond the glass. I wanted to tell him he was imagining it, that he was just tired. But I couldn't, because as I sat there, gripping the phone, my own room dark except for the dim glow of the streetlight outside, I heard it too, soft, distant, somewhere outside my house. Tap, 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 tap. And that's when I knew we never left it behind. It followed us home, and it was still watching, still waiting. The woods weren't haunted. It was a few years ago, during the fall, when I found myself working at an old hospital in a small town that had seen better days. The kind of hospital that had once been a bustling center for medical care, but over time had been forgotten, left to fade into the background of modern healthcare facilities. This hospital had its history, and from the very first time I walked through its doors, I could feel it. The air in the building was heavy, like it was holding on to something from the past. The walls had a dull, yellowish way, and the floors creaked under the weight of every step. The windows, though big, were always covered with a layer of grime, as though the outside world had been shut out for decades. I had just finished my studies and was eager to start my career, so when I received the job offer to work there as an intern, I didn't think twice. The town was quiet, and the work seemed straightforward enough. The staff was small, but the atmosphere seemed pleasant, almost too pleasant. There was an old nurse named Miss Langston who had worked there for years. She was a no-nonsense woman, with gray hair always neatly tied back in a bun. She spoke of the hospital with a certain fondness, but there was always something off about her, something in her eyes that made me uneasy. Alongside me were a couple of other interns who had started around the same time. We were all fresh-faced, eager to prove ourselves, and we quickly settled into a routine. The hospital had a small staff, nurses, a few doctors, and a handful of administrative workers. Everyone kept to themselves, and there was an unspoken rule about how things worked around there. The older staff, especially Ms. Langston, were often around to supervise, but they seemed to do so from a distance, as if there was a tacit understanding that we were to handle things on our own. Our days were simple. We'd check on the patients, run errands for the senior staff, and assist in basic procedures. But as time went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things. The way the building seemed to hum with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, or how certain rooms always felt a little colder than the rest. But it wasn't until one late night that I started to notice something truly unsettling. The hospital itself had this peculiar energy to it, like it had a life of its own. It was an older building, and the very air inside felt thick, as if it had absorbed every sound, every whisper, every footstep from the years gone by. There were parts of the hospital that we didn't use anymore, old wings and unused hallways that were closed off, but even the ones we did use felt strangely alive, as though, at any moment, someone or something might walk through those doors, unnoticed by anyone but me. At first, it was just something I chalked up to being a new employee in an unfamiliar environment. But the more I worked there, the more those strange little details started to add up. One evening, I was assigned to work the night shift. I remember the air felt unusually thick that night, and the hospital seemed eerily silent, even more so than usual. It was late, well past midnight, and the hospital seemed to be slowly winding down. Most of the staff had already gone home, and the few who remained were scattered in different parts of the building, quietly going about their duties. I was walking through the corridors, making my rounds to check on the patients, when I noticed something strange. The lights in the hallways flickered, not in a rhythmic pattern like the electrical system was malfunctioning, but in a sporadic, almost deliberate way. They blinked on and off as if they were trying to tell me something. I paused, unsure of what I was witnessing, but the flickering stopped almost as suddenly as it had started. I continued down the hall, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled in my stomach. The silence was overwhelming. As I passed by one of the rooms, I heard a faint sound. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, like a murmur or a whisper, but there was no one inside. The patient in that room was sound asleep. The feeling in my gut intensified, and I began to feel an overwhelming sense of unease. My footsteps echoed through the corridor as I made my way to the nurse's station. That's when I saw Miss Langston again. She was sitting at her desk, staring at a pile of paperwork, but her eyes weren't focused. She was gazing at something in the distance, a blank, vacant stare on her face. When I approached her, she didn't react at first. It was only when I spoke her name that she slowly turned to look at me, her eyes finally meeting mine. "You're working late tonight," she said, her voice soft, almost too soft, as if it didn't belong to her. I nodded, unsure of what to say. There was something strange in her gaze, something that made my skin crawl. "Be careful," she said in a low voice, almost a whisper. "The hospital has its own way of remembering." I didn't know what to make of it, but her words lingered in my mind as I returned to my rounds. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed a darkened room, it felt like there was someone or something watching me from within. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But I couldn't escape the sense that there was something in that hospital, something ancient, lurking just beyond the veil of the ordinary. That night, I went to bed with a lingering unease, convinced I had imagined it all. But the next day, things would take a turn, and that feeling would only grow stronger as the strange events in the hospital began to escalate. The next day, everything seemed normal at first. The morning shift began like any other. The staff was busy with their usual tasks, nurses going from room to room, doctors making rounds, and the interns, like me, shuffling paperwork or attending to the smallest of duties. But something was different this time. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it lingered in the air like a thick fog, making every task feel slightly more difficult than it should have. I was in the break room, filling out some paperwork, when I overheard a conversation between a couple of the older nurses. They were talking in hushed tones, so at first I couldn't catch much. But then I heard the words, "the old wing," and too many unexplained noises. I couldn't help but lean in closer, curious. I had heard whispers about the old wing before, but no one ever spoke about it directly. It was always left as a rumor, an afterthought, something everyone knew existed but never acknowledged. "Has anyone else heard it?" one of the nurses asked quietly. The other nurse sighed deeply, her hands trembling slightly as she folded a pile of sheets. "I heard something last night, not just the usual creaks and groans. This was something different." The first nurse shook her head. "It's probably just your nerves. That place has been closed off for years. No one goes in there anymore." But the second nurse wasn't convinced. "I don't know. It felt alive, like something was trying to reach out." The conversation trailed off as they noticed me standing there, and I quickly pretended to focus on my task, my heart suddenly racing. I had no idea what they were referring to, but it left an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The day went on, but something in the air remained. It wasn't until later that afternoon, as I was walking through the hospital's main hallway, that I saw it, the first real sign that something wasn't quite right. As I passed one of the patient rooms, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. This wasn't unusual, as sometimes patients or nurses would leave the doors open, but something about it caught my attention. It wasn't the door itself, but the fact that it was so perfectly still. Most of the time, you'd see a slight draft that would cause the doors to shift a little, but this one didn't move at all. I hesitated, my curiosity pushing me closer to the door. As I leaned in to take a peek, I saw something even stranger. The light inside the room was flickering rapidly. It wasn't the usual flicker that happens when a bulb is about to go out. It was almost rhythmic, like a pulse, steady and deliberate. I stepped closer, my hand hovering near the doorknob, when the light suddenly snapped back to normal. I blinked, unsure of what I'd just witnessed. I pushed the door open, but when I entered, everything seemed perfectly fine. The room was empty, the bed neatly made, the window cracked open just a bit to let in the fresh air. I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. Maybe I had imagined the flickering, I thought, or perhaps there was a problem with the electrical system. It wasn't that strange for a hospital of this age. Still, the feeling in my chest didn't go away. I made my way to the nurse's station, intending to tell Miss Langston about the strange occurrence. But when I arrived, I found her staring at a wall of monitors, her face expressionless as she scrolled through a list of charts. I hesitated, but she spoke before I could say anything. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Her voice was quiet but sharp, as though she had been waiting for someone to acknowledge what had been happening. "See what?" I asked, my voice trailing off. There was no denying it anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She didn't respond immediately, only giving me a long, knowing look before turning back to the monitors. "You're not the first," she finally said, almost under her breath. "This building is full of memories, and some of those memories don't stay quiet." I didn't know what she meant, but I didn't press her for more information. The tension in the air had become palpable. The hospital felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding something back. It wasn't just the flickering lights or the strange door. There was something else, something that I couldn't put into words. That night, I worked another late shift. I tried to put the weird events of the day behind me, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But as the hours passed, I couldn't ignore the oddities around me. The air grew colder, and the hum of the old hospital's machinery seemed louder than usual. The lights flickered again, this time not just in one room, but all down the hall. I tried to dismiss it as a power surge or something technical, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. As I walked past one of the patient rooms, I saw it again, a door slightly ajar, just like the one I had seen earlier. My heartbeat quickened as I approached, and once again, the light inside was flickering erratically. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulb above. I took a step inside, my shoes barely making a sound on the cold floor. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. I scanned the room, and that's when I saw it. On the far side, sitting in the corner, was an old chair. It was empty, but there was something strange about it, something about the way it was positioned. It looked as though someone had just gotten up and left in a hurry. But as I stepped closer, I felt it, a coldness sharper than anything it felt before. It wasn't just the temperature, it was a presence. Something in the room was watching me, something I couldn't see but could feel with every inch of my skin. I backed out of the room slowly, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, the pressure of the long shifts getting to me. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. That was the moment I realized that there was more to this hospital than met the eye. It wasn't just an old building. It was a place filled with strange occurrences, things that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. And the more I tried to understand it, the more I felt myself slipping into a world that didn't make sense. I knew then that I wasn't just hearing things or seeing things. I was experiencing something real, something that no one could easily dismiss. As the days went on, the strange occurrences became more frequent. At first, I thought it might just be me, perhaps the stress of working long shifts or the creeping fatigue of night after night spent in the sterile corridors of the hospital. But by the third night in a row, I knew something was wrong. I had just finished helping an elderly patient settle into his room when the first sign came. A loud, echoing thud sounded from somewhere deep in the building, down one of the long, unused corridors that no one dared to visit. It was a dull sound, like a heavy object being dropped, followed by a brief silence. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether I had imagined it. I glanced around, but everyone else was busy with their tasks, oblivious to the noise. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The nurse at the front desk, Evelyn, looked up from her chart and met my gaze. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice low and uncertain. I nodded, but neither of us said anything further. We both knew that hallway, the old section of the hospital that had been sealed off years ago. No one went in there. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The lights flickered more often, and the coldness in the air seemed to have settled deeper into the walls. I walked the halls, trying to remain focused on my duties, but every corner felt ominous, as though the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting. Later, I found myself standing in front of that same patient room, the one with the doors slightly ajar. This time, I was determined to investigate further, to find the source of all these unsettling occurrences. The room was empty, just as I had left it, the bed perfectly made. But the air in the room was heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite describe. The light above flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls. I stepped inside cautiously, feeling the cold creeping up my spine. That same chair was still positioned in the corner, but now it was facing directly toward the bed, as though someone had moved it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I took a step closer. The chair was too still, too unnervingly neat. No one had been in this room for hours. Why was it like this? I reached out to touch the back of the chair, but just as my fingers brushed against it, the light above flickered violently. My breath caught in my throat as the light buzzed and popped before it went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, I stood there, completely frozen, waiting for my eyes to adjust. Then, from somewhere deep within the room, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart skipped a beat. The air felt impossibly colder, the kind of cold that settled deep into your bones. I backed out of the room quickly, my pulse racing. But as I turned to leave, I felt a sudden weight in the air, a pressure that I couldn't explain. Something was wrong. Something was definitely wrong. That's when I began to realize the extent of what was happening. It wasn't just lights flickering or doors creaking. The building was changing, or maybe it had always been this way, and I had never noticed. There were more and more of these small, seemingly insignificant incidents. The door handles that felt unusually cold, the faint whispers of voices that echoed through the empty hallways, the flickering lights that seemed to dance along the walls, moving in strange patterns that I couldn't make sense of. One night, after the hospital had grown quiet, I decided to investigate the old wing, the part of the hospital that had been abandoned for years. I had overheard the nurses' whispers about it, the stories they told in hushed tones. They said the place was haunted, cursed even, but I had always dismissed it as just superstition. Now, with everything it experienced, I wasn't so sure. The old wing was at the far end of the hospital, a section of the building that had been shut off after a series of accidents and unexplained deaths. The doors were locked, but I had a spare key, and curiosity drove me forward. As I made my way down the hallway, the lights above flickered erratically, casting long, ghostly shadows that stretched across the walls. The further I went, the colder the air became, and the silence grew deeper. I reached the first room on the left, and as I opened the door, I was hit with a wave of stale air. The room was filled with old medical equipment, covered in dust and cobwebs, the remnants of a time long past. But it wasn't the room itself that caught my attention. It was the faint sound of something soft, like a breath, like a whisper, coming from inside. My heart raced as I stepped further into the room, my eyes scanning every corner, but there was nothing. No one. Just the remains of old furniture and equipment. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I walked deeper into the abandoned wing, opening door after door, each one leading to more decay, more emptiness. That was when I found it. At the end of the hall, there was a door that was different from the others. It was slightly ajar, but the strange thing was that there was no dust on the handle, no cobwebs in the corner. It had been recently opened. My hand shook as I reached for the door and pushed it open. Inside, the room was completely dark. I couldn't see a thing. I fumbled for the light switch, and as soon as the lights flickered on, I saw it, an old hospital bed, positioned in the center of the room, with straps on the sides, as if someone had once been restrained there. The bed was perfectly neat, almost too neat. I slowly walked closer, and that's when I noticed something else. A set of old footprints, stained in what looked like dried blood, leading up to the bed. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. The room felt suffocating, the air so thick that it was hard to breathe. And then, as I stood there, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air. The room felt alive with something I couldn't see, something watching me. I quickly turned to leave, but as I reached the door, the lights flickered again and went out, plunging me into darkness once more. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my own breath was deafening in the silence. And then, from behind me, I heard it, a low, raspy laugh. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, still, and silent. I didn't wait to find out if it would happen again. I sprinted out of the room, my legs trembling beneath me as I rushed through the darkened hallways of the old wing. My mind raced, but nothing made sense. The sound, the cold, the footsteps, it was all too much. When I finally reached the main section of the hospital, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The night was darker than usual, even though the lights above flickered erratically, casting fleeting shadows across the walls. I couldn't shake the unease that had been building ever since my first encounter in the old wing of the hospital. It was like the building itself was breathing, its walls pulsing with a sinister rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of my own heart. I tried to go about my work as usual, but every step I took felt heavier, as though the air around me had thickened and turned against me. I had convinced myself that I was overreacting, that it was just the stress of the job getting to me. But tonight, everything felt different. The atmosphere in the hospital was suffocating, as if it was closing in on me with every passing moment. Every door creaked, every light flickered, and every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too far. I could feel it, an oppressive presence, lingering in every corner, watching me. Evelyn, the nurse at the front desk, was the first to notice. I had just walked past her, heading to check on the new patients, when she called out to me, her voice shaking. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she gripped the desk. I nodded, though I hadn't heard anything yet, but I felt it. I felt the air grow colder, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. We both turned toward the hallway where the old wing began, and it was as though the building itself had come alive, its very bones groaning in protest. A low, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the hall, faint but unmistakable. It was a sound that didn't belong to any living thing. The air seemed to vibrate with it, rattling the walls and my nerves alike. "What was that?" Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, though my own voice felt alien to me. It was the first time in a long while that I had truly felt afraid. We stood frozen for a moment, but then something snapped. A distant scream echoed from the farthest corner of the building, the sound shrill and full of panic. It wasn't a patient's cry, not like the ones we were used to hearing in the middle of the night. No, this was something else, something much darker, a scream that spoke of fear and desperation. Evelyn and I exchanged a look, our faces drained of color. Without saying a word, we both knew what we had to do. We had to investigate. There was no other choice. We crept down the hallway toward the source of the scream, our footsteps muffled by the thick silence that had settled over the building. Every step felt like a betrayal of our instincts, like we were walking straight into the heart of something that was waiting for us. The cold was unbearable, and it seemed to be growing colder with each passing second. I could feel the chill in my bones, creeping deeper and deeper into my skin until I felt like I might freeze from the inside out. As we neared the old wing, I noticed that the door to the storage room, the one I had passed by countless times before, was slightly ajar. I don't know why I was drawn to it, but something about that door called to me, as though it was inviting me inside. I reached out to push it open, but as my hand brushed against the cold metal, a voice stopped me. "Don't open it." I froze, my heart racing. The voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway behind me was empty, just as it had been moments ago. Evelyn, looking visibly shaken, grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "We need to get out of here," she urged, her voice trembling. But I couldn't move. Something was drawing me to that room. It felt like it was pulling at me, as though the very walls of the hospital were urging me to enter. Despite every instinct telling me to run, I pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, its corners obscured by shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. But the thing that struck me the most was the smell, something putrid, like decay and rot. It overwhelmed my senses, making me gag as I stumbled backward. There, in the center of the room, was an old, rusted surgical table. Bloodstains marred the metal surface, and the floor beneath it was slick with something dark and viscous. And then I saw it. A figure, hunched over and shrouded in darkness, was standing beside the table. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. I couldn't make out its face. There was no face, just a featureless mask of shadow. But I could feel its eyes on me, burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It spoke, its voice raspy and cold, as if the words had been dragged from the depths of the grave itself. "Leave this place, before it's too late." I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. My heart was pounding, my body frozen in terror. But Evelyn, who had been standing behind me, was the first to react. She turned and bolted down the hallway, screaming for help. But the moment she moved, the figure let out a low, bone-chilling laugh, and the air around me seemed to distort, like the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The temperature plummeted further, and I could see my breath in front of me, sharp and visible in the air. The figure's shadow stretched, reaching out toward me with long, skeletal hands. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as though they were made of stone. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything went still. The shadowy figure was gone. The room was silent once more, save for the sound of my own labored breathing. The only evidence of what had happened was the overwhelming sense of dread that lingered in the air, suffocating me, choking the very life out of me. I looked around, half expecting the figure to reappear, but it didn't. The room was empty. That's when I realized the truth. The hospital wasn't haunted, it was the haunting. The walls, the rooms, the halls, they were all alive, and they were watching. The spirits that had once walked this place were still here, trapped in the building, and they were angry. I ran, not bothering to look back, and didn't stop until I reached the safety of the front desk. Evelyn was already there, her face pale and her hands shaking uncontrollably. She didn't need to ask what had happened. I could see the terror in her eyes. We were both living in a nightmare, and we were no longer safe. The hours after our encounter in that forsaken room seemed to stretch on forever. The tension in the air was unbearable, thick with the weight of what we had seen and experienced. Evelyn and I remained at the front desk, our hands trembling as we tried to gather our thoughts. The staff had begun to gather, murmuring nervously about the strange occurrences they had been noticing throughout the night. But it was clear that none of them had witnessed what we had. No one had seen the dark figure in the storage room or heard the chilling voice that had commanded us to leave. I could still feel the cold creeping into my bones, as though I had not fully escaped the clutches of that room. My mind raced with questions, unanswered questions. What had that figure been? Why was it here, in this hospital? What did it want from us? Evelyn sat across from me, her face pale and drawn. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with the pressure. She hadn't said much since we fled from the old wing. I could sense her fear, her disbelief, but there was something else in her eyes too. Something darker, more resigned. "We can't stay here," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. She spoke as though she was stating a fact, not asking a question. There was no more questioning, no more doubting. We both knew that we had to leave. Whatever we had encountered was still here, lurking within the hospital's walls, and it wasn't going to stop until we were gone. I didn't answer her at first. I couldn't. The thought of leaving, of abandoning everything I had worked for, was almost too much to bear. This was my job, my life. I couldn't just walk away. But as I sat there, my mind replaying the terrifying images of the shadowy figure and the overwhelming presence in the building, I realized there was no choice. We were being hunted. The others in the hospital had started to filter out as well. The night shift was drawing to a close, and the eerie sense of dread had only grown stronger. Some of the nurses were visibly shaken, unable to conceal their fear. They spoke in hushed voices, trying to make sense of the strange happenings, but no one seemed to know what was going on or how to stop it. It was then that I decided we couldn't stay, not with that thing still out there. It had been waiting for us. I had no idea how long it had been in the building or what it had been doing, but one thing was certain. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a prison, and we were its captives. "We're leaving," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. Evelyn nodded, her eyes wide but resolute. She grabbed her jacket, and we both stood up, moving toward the exit. It felt wrong, as though we were betraying the very place that had been our sanctuary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, that the building itself was urging us to leave. The doors of the hospital seemed to open in slow motion, as if they too were reluctant to let us go. The air outside was cold, but the chill was nothing compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside the hospital. We stepped out onto the sidewalk, the sounds of the world outside grounding me, offering a brief moment of relief. But as I turned to look back at the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. I felt its gaze even from the distance, like a heavy weight pressing against my chest. "We're done here," Evelyn said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "It's over." I nodded, though I didn't feel convinced. The hospital loomed behind us, its windows dark and empty. The whole place seemed like it was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to return. We didn't know what would happen next. We didn't know if anyone would believe us or if they would simply write it off as an overactive imagination, the result of too many long shifts and too little sleep. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. And I knew that whatever had been in that building wasn't finished with us yet. In the days that followed, we did what we could to put the events behind us. Evelyn took a leave of absence from the hospital, and I resigned. The decision to leave was difficult, but it was the only choice we had. I tried to continue with my life, to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the memories of that night lingered like a dark cloud over everything I did. I couldn't forget the chilling voice, the oppressive darkness, or the feeling of being hunted. The building might have been miles away now, but it felt as though it was still with me, following me wherever I went. Months later, Evelyn called me one evening, her voice trembling with urgency. "I've been back to the hospital," she said, barely able to get the words out. "I had to see for myself, and you won't believe what I found." I froze, the blood draining from my face. The hospital had been abandoned. At least that's what we had been told. But Evelyn's words sent a chill down my spine. "It's not abandoned," she continued, her voice shaking. "They've reopened it, and they've moved new patients in. I don't know why, but it's still there, lurking in the shadows." I saw it. I saw the same figure. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't respond, not because I didn't believe her, but because I knew exactly what she was talking about. The thing we had encountered in the old wing was still there, waiting for its next victim. I don't know what happened to the hospital after that. I don't know if anyone else has experienced the terror that we felt that night. But one thing I do know is this: some places are never truly abandoned. Some places never let go. And the hospital, it's still out there, waiting, watching, always waiting for the next person to cross its threshold. The months that followed our escape from the hospital felt like a strange blur, as if we were both trying to return to a normal life while haunted by the ghosts of our past. Every step I took, every corner I turned, I felt as though something was watching, waiting. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been shifted, altered by the horrors we had encountered in that abandoned building. But no matter how far I went, the memories didn't fade. In fact, they only grew stronger, more persistent. I tried to forget. I tried to put everything that had happened out of my mind, convincing myself that it was just a bad dream, a product of exhaustion and overactive imagination. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark figure, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent, its form shifting in and out of the shadows. The voice still echoed in my ears, a constant reminder of the terror that had gripped me that night. It had been so real, so vivid, that I couldn't shake it. I had seen it with my own eyes, felt it with my own skin. Evelyn and I rarely spoke after that final phone call. The distance between us seemed to grow with each passing day. It wasn't because we didn't care for each other, but because the trauma of what we had experienced was too great to share. I would think of calling her, of asking how she was, but the fear always crept back in. What if the hospital came for her too? What if it followed her, just like it followed me? I didn't know if I could live with that. Then, one evening, I received a letter. It was from the hospital. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some sort of clerical error. But as I read through it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The letter was an official invitation to return to the hospital. They had heard of my departure, of my resignation, and they wanted to offer me a position again. They assured me that things had changed, that the hospital was now under new management, and all of the unfortunate events had been resolved. I stared at the letter for what felt like hours. It was almost laughable, wasn't it? After everything I had gone through, after all the evidence that something dark and terrible was at work within those walls, they were asking me to come back? How could they be so blind, so naive? Or was this a trap, a way to lure me back into their grasp? I couldn't decide. The invitation haunted me for weeks. I didn't know what to do. The thought of returning to the place that had caused me so much pain, so much fear, was unbearable. But a part of me, just a small part, wondered what had happened. Had things really changed? Or was it all just a facade, a way to cover up the truth? I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, if I went back, I would finally get the answers I needed. I would confront the thing that had tormented us, put an end to it once and for all. I threw the letter away. It wasn't until a few weeks later that Evelyn called me again. This time, her voice was frantic, her words tumbling out in a rush. She had gone back to the hospital. Despite everything we had seen, despite the terror that had gripped her, she had returned. She had heard rumors, whispers among the staff about strange things happening, about the building still harboring its dark secrets. And when she went back, she had seen it again, the figure, the dark presence. It was still there, still waiting. I couldn't breathe. I don't know what it is about places like that, about hospitals like the one we had worked at, but they have a way of drawing people in. They have a way of keeping hold of you, even when you think you've escaped. Maybe it's the promise of redemption, of healing, or maybe it's something more insidious. Whatever it is, the hospital had a grip on Evelyn, and it had a grip on me too. We never spoke after that night. Not in person, at least. There were no more phone calls, no more letters. I heard rumors of the hospital being shut down, of the building being condemned, but nothing ever came of it. The hospital, it seemed, was simply forgotten, like so many other places with dark pasts. And for a while, I thought that was the end of it. But then, one night, years later, I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a news article about the hospital. The building had been demolished. They said it was for safety reasons, that the structure had become unstable over the years. But the picture that accompanied the article, the one showing the rubble of the hospital, the remnants of what had once been a place of healing, had something else in it. In the corner of the photo, faint but unmistakable, was the shadow of a figure. It was dark and distorted, almost as if it was shifting in and out of existence. But there it was, unmistakable. The figure that had haunted us, that had tormented us for so long, was still there. I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know if the hospital truly was haunted, if the figure was real, or if it was all just the result of too many long nights in a place that should have never been allowed to exist. All I know is that sometimes, late at night, I still feel it, the weight of its presence, the cold touch of its fingers. And I wonder if we'll ever truly escape it. It was the summer of 2002, a time when the air smelled of salt and the ocean's constant hum seemed to soothe even the most restless of minds. I had been working as a lighthouse keeper on a small island off the coast, far from the reach of tourists and far from the noise of the world. It was a quiet, routine job, one that I thought I could handle easily. The island was small, uninhabited by anyone but myself and a few others, but it was a peaceful existence. At least, that's how it felt in the beginning. The lighthouse stood tall, perched on the cliffs at the edge of the island, its white stone walls contrasting against the endless blue of the sky and the deep greens of the surrounding forest. I had grown accustomed to the view, to the smell of the sea breeze that seemed to carry a certain heaviness with it. It wasn't a bad life, honestly. I worked long hours maintaining the lighthouse light, making sure it was in perfect condition to guide ships through the treacherous waters nearby. On the off days, I explored the island, hiking its rugged terrain, reading old books, and simply enjoying the solitude. The island was far enough from the mainland that the only way to get there was by boat. Every few days, a supply ship would come in, bringing what I needed: food, water, the occasional new book. The boatman, an older man named Frank, had been doing this job for years. He was the closest thing I had to regular company, though our conversations were always brief and filled with a sense of quiet respect for the isolation we both knew too well. On one particular day, Frank arrived later than usual. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and he'd been finishing up some repairs on the lighthouse. The sun had started to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the rocks below. Frank's boat finally appeared on the horizon, its silhouette cutting through the evening light. But as he pulled closer, I noticed something strange. The boat was drifting more than usual, and Frank wasn't steering it. I rushed down to the dock, heart racing, and as the boat finally came to a stop, I noticed Frank slumped over the wheel, unconscious. Panicking, I pulled him out and onto the dock. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and he didn't seem to be responding to anything I said. It wasn't until a few minutes later, when I managed to get him back on his feet, that he looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "It's bad out there," he muttered, barely able to form a sentence. His voice was strained, and there was a wild look in his eyes. I don't know what it was, but something's not right. He was shaking, his hands trembling as he struggled to explain. But whatever it was that had happened out on the water, Frank couldn't, or wouldn't, elaborate further. He simply insisted that I stay inside the lighthouse, lock the doors, and avoid the cliffs at all costs. I didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't like Frank to behave this way. He had been out here countless times before, and nothing ever seemed to faze him. But that day, something had shaken him to his core. It was as if he had seen something out there on the open water, something that had broken his calm demeanor and left him with a sense of dread that I could feel in my bones. That night, after Frank left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The lighthouse was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the sea muted, as if the very world around me was holding its breath. I tried to focus on my work, to keep myself busy with the routine maintenance, but the feeling of unease only grew. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks of the old lighthouse, and the waves below crashed violently against the rocks. As I sat in the lighthouse's small kitchen, a thought began to creep into my mind, a thought I couldn't quite dismiss. What had Frank seen out there? What had he experienced that was so horrifying? Was it just his age, or was there something more sinister at play? I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was really going on. Little did I know that this was just the beginning, and that the true terror of the lighthouse was only just starting to reveal itself. The following morning, I tried to shake off the tension that had settled over me like a heavy fog. I told myself Frank was just tired, that maybe he had been overworked or had simply imagined whatever it was that scared him so badly. I went about my usual routine, checking the light at the top of the lighthouse, doing maintenance on the generator, and preparing for the next shipment of supplies. It was just another day, or so I thought. The island, with its jagged coastline and dense forests, was never particularly quiet. The sounds of the sea crashing against the rocks, the occasional cry of seagulls, and the rustling of trees were constant companions. But that morning, something was off. The wind had died down, leaving the air unnervingly still. It wasn't just the absence of noise, It was the absence of movement. No birds flew overhead. No leaves fluttered in the trees. The world felt as though it had paused, waiting. I tried to focus on the task at hand. The lighthouse was old, and I often had to make small repairs to keep things running smoothly. But as I climbed the spiral staircase to check the lantern room, something caught my attention. The lantern, which had been burning brightly the night before, was dimming. Not gradually, as it would if the fuel were running low, but suddenly and with no clear cause. I leaned in closer, checking the mechanism, but everything appeared normal. I dismissed it as a minor glitch. It happened from time to time. The lighthouse's old wiring could be temperamental, but I knew it well enough to fix it. But the unease I felt lingered. I felt eyes on me, though I was alone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. As I worked through the morning, strange little things began to happen. At one point, I heard a faint tapping at the window, so quiet I thought I was imagining it. I turned, half expecting to see a bird or a branch brushing against the glass, but there was nothing. The window was clear, the view to the ocean uninterrupted. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself that the tapping had come from somewhere else on the island, a tree swaying in the wind perhaps. But when I turned back to my work, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. Later that afternoon, as I stood on the balcony of the lighthouse, gazing out at the endless expanse of water, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just the mist rolling in, but it didn't look quite right. There was a fog, but it was moving in a way that didn't seem natural. It wasn't the usual slow drift. It was gathering in a swirling mass, moving in unnatural patterns. And within that mist, there were shapes that seemed to shift and change, almost as if they were alive. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the fog was gone. Just like that. The water below was calm, the sky was clear. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing games with me, fueled by the tension from the previous night. Still, my heart was racing as I stepped back inside, the chill of the air sticking to my skin. When Frank had warned me about staying away from the cliffs, I thought he was just being overly cautious. But now, as I stood there, I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right about the island, about the way the air felt, about the way the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The isolation of the lighthouse, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. I couldn't shake the thought that something was waiting out there, just beyond my reach. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle faintly in the sky, I tried to put it all out of my mind. But no matter how hard I tried, sleep wouldn't come. The quiet of the lighthouse felt suffocating, the stillness too heavy. I had gotten used to the sounds of the ocean, the gentle lullaby of waves crashing on the rocks. But now, in the dead of night, the silence seemed deafening. Around midnight, I was lying in my bed when I heard it again. A faint tapping, just like before. I shot up, heart pounding in my chest, and listened intently. It was coming from the window again. Slowly, cautiously, I crept toward the glass, my breath shallow. The tapping continued, soft but persistent. When I finally mustered the courage to look out, I saw nothing but the black expanse of the ocean, the moonlight casting faint shadows on the water below. I don't know why I did it, but I opened the window, just a crack. The air that rushed in was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. I leaned out, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had caused the sound. My mind raced, trying to explain it away. It could have been a bird, a branch, or something else. But as I stood there, a sense of dread washed over me, chilling me to the bone. That's when I saw it a shape in the distance, far out on the water. It was moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. A boat. No, a figure. A person standing on the edge of the water. It looked like someone was walking toward the lighthouse, though the sea was far too rough for anyone to be out there, especially at this hour. I snapped the window shut, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I had to be hallucinating, I hadn't been sleeping well, and the isolation was starting to get to me. But the image lingered, burned into my mind. There was something about it that felt wrong, unnatural, as if the figure shouldn't have been there at all. It wasn't just that it was impossible. It was that it shouldn't have been. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the ocean, my eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The waves gently rolled in. The lighthouse light flickered occasionally, but the figure never returned. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting for me to notice. The next morning, I went about my usual routine, but the strange events kept piling up. Each little thing seemed insignificant on its own, but together, they painted a picture of something more sinister, something beyond what I could understand. The tapping continued, but now it was joined by other sounds. Footsteps in the halls, whispers just on the edge of hearing, the rustling of unseen movement. I was beginning to wonder if I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Something was happening on this island. Something that had been waiting for me. And as I sat alone in the lighthouse, the creeping feeling of dread slowly gnawing at my nerves, I realized that I might not make it out of this place. Not alive. Not whole. The shadows were closing in, and I had no idea how to stop them. By the third day, I could no longer ignore the mounting tension that seemed to saturate the very air around the lighthouse. The strange incidents had gone from being sporadic, almost explainable moments, to something far more consistent, more unsettling. The island no longer felt like a place of solitude and peace. It felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, every faint whisper on the edges of my hearing was enough to make my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. That afternoon, I set out to investigate the island more thoroughly. I'd walked the grounds before, but I hadn't paid much attention to the strange corners or hidden paths that ran along the cliffs. Frank's warning about the edge of the island had stuck in my mind, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was out there, and I was determined to find out what it was. The wind had picked up that morning, sending gusts of salty air crashing against the rocks below. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the island, tall and imposing, its beacon casting a sweeping light across the dark waters. I made my way toward the cliffs, my boots crunching against the gravel path that wound its way through the overgrown grass. The island seemed even more desolate than I remembered. The trees bent unnaturally, as though the wind had twisted them into strange shapes. The once crisp air felt heavier now, charged with something I couldn't quite place. I walked to the cliffside, my eyes scanning the horizon. There was nothing unusual about the view. The sea stretched out endlessly before me, the horizon blending seamlessly into the sky. But as I stood there, something caught my eye. A shadow, a flicker at the edge of the water, just out of view. It was brief, and when I blinked, it was gone. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a step closer to the edge, squinting my eyes. Nothing. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of unease that had settled over me. It had to be my imagination. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt that something was off. The silence was oppressive now. There were no seagulls, no sounds of waves crashing against the rocks, just the faint, distant crash of the ocean far below. The air smelled faintly of brine, but there was something else too, something sharp and metallic, like the scent of iron. I turned away from the cliff, heading back toward the lighthouse. I couldn't get that shadow out of my mind. It hadn't been a trick of the light, I was sure of it. But what could it have been? I tried to shake the thought from my head, but my nerves were on edge. I reached the lighthouse again, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I went to the lighthouse's lantern room to check the light. The lighthouse was my responsibility, after all. It had always been a comforting place, a source of stability. But tonight, it felt like something more sinister. The flickering light inside the lamp room caught my attention. I went to check the mechanism, but the bulb was fine, the oil tank full. Yet, the light continued to flicker, as if there was something interfering with it. I tapped the glass, watching the bulbs sputter and dim. I leaned closer, trying to inspect it. That's when I heard it again, the tapping. The same faint, rhythmic sound it heard earlier. I froze. It was coming from outside, but there was no one there. Not that I could see, at least. The wind had picked up again, howling through the cracks in the building, but the sound was too deliberate. It was too regular. I opened the window of the lantern room and stepped out onto the narrow balcony that wrapped around the lighthouse. My breath hitched in my chest as I scanned the horizon. In the distance, there was something moving on the shore. A figure, a shadow, just barely visible against the backdrop of the rocky coastline. I squinted, but the figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared. My heart raced, my pulse thumping in my ears. It was impossible. There was no one on the island except for me. I slammed the window shut, retreating back inside the lighthouse, trying to calm myself. The air was thick with tension, and every movement, every sound, made me jump. The wind had picked up, now more of a steady, eerie howl that seemed to reverberate through the walls of the lighthouse. The next morning, I decided to explore the island further. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I had to know what was happening. As I walked along the edge of the cliffs again, the sensation of being watched grew even more intense. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My skin prickled. The air smelled of salt water and something else, something darker. The fog had rolled in thick, swirling around me like a living thing. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The world was reduced to shades of gray, the outlines of the cliff and the lighthouse barely visible in the mist. I had to squint to make out anything at all. The silence was unnerving. There were no birds, no animals, nothing. Just the oppressive stillness of the fog. I kept walking, driven by an overwhelming need to understand. What was happening to the island? Why did I feel so drawn to the cliffs? I reached the spot where I had seen the figure the night before, and my stomach churned. There was something in the water, something large and dark. I could barely make it out through the thick fog, but I knew it was there. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. I knew I wasn't imagining it now. I wasn't alone. But who or what could be out there? Was it Frank? Was it someone else? I couldn't be sure. My mind raced with questions, none of which had answers. I didn't know what was worse, the thought that something was on the island with me, or the thought that maybe I was simply losing my mind. The fog pressed in even tighter, suffocating in its density. I turned to head back toward the lighthouse, but the way forward seemed disorienting, as if the landscape had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. I felt trapped in a maze, unable to find my way out. Every turn seemed to bring me back to the same spot, the same fog, the same feeling of being watched. I hurried back to the lighthouse, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. My pulse hammered in my chest. When I reached the door, I slammed it shut behind me, heart racing. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The shadows inside the lighthouse seemed darker now, as though they were waiting, lurking just beyond the light. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping returned, louder this time, insistent. I lay in bed, listening, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Was it the window? The door? The floorboards? It was as if the whole building was alive with strange sounds, each one making my pulse race. I couldn't keep still. I had to find out what was going on, what was happening to me and to the island. But as I got up to investigate, the light in the lantern room flickered once more, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was happening, something beyond my understanding. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to spiral out of control. The fog, the shadows, the whispers, each one grew stronger, more tangible. I had to face whatever was out there. I had no choice. The night was upon me again, thick and suffocating. The moon barely broke through the fog that clung to the island like a dense, living creature. My mind felt as though it had been twisted by the fear that had been steadily gnawing at me for days. No matter what I told myself, No matter how I tried to rationalize the events, the tension had escalated into something undeniable. I had no answers, only questions, and no peace, only a gnawing terror that ate away at me with each passing hour. I had tried to ignore it. I had tried to convince myself that the strange happenings were nothing more than my imagination running wild. But when the light in the lantern room flickered once again, I knew I couldn't escape the truth any longer. The tapping sound returned, just as it had every night. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a random knock or tap. It was methodical, deliberate, almost rhythmic. It seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, from the very foundation of the lighthouse itself. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every part of me screamed to run, to flee from whatever dark force was closing in on me. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood what was happening. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the bed, the beam cutting through the shadows that seemed to be growing thicker by the minute. The air was cold now, biting, and the faint scent of iron, the same metallic smell I had noticed earlier, lingered in the room. It wasn't just the wind anymore, it was something else, something darker. With shaky hands, I opened the door and stepped into the hall. The tapping persisted, echoing down the narrow corridors like a heartbeat. I moved cautiously, trying to remain silent, my footsteps soft on the old wooden floor. I made my way to the stairs that led down to the lower levels of the lighthouse. My heart raced with each step, the fear in my chest tightening like a vice. The stairs creaked beneath me, the sound amplified in the silence. As I reached the bottom, I noticed a faint, flickering light coming from the cellar door. The light in the lantern room had been steadily dimming, and now, this light, pale and unnatural, was the only thing breaking the suffocating darkness. I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. The light called to me, drawing me closer, pulling me toward whatever waited beneath the floor. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. The moment my fingers brushed against it, the tapping stopped. Absolute silence enveloped the lighthouse, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I hesitated, frozen in place. Then, without warning, the door creaked open on its own. I stepped into the cellar. The light was coming from a small oil lamp on the far side of the room, casting long, flickering shadows across the cracked walls. The air was damp, musty, and smelled of decay. There were crates stacked in the corner, old furniture covered in dust, but it was the far wall that caught my attention. It was different. There, embedded in the stone wall, was a door I had never seen before. It wasn't part of the original structure of the lighthouse. It was as if it had always been hidden, concealed behind layers of stone and time. My blood ran cold as I moved closer, every instinct in my body telling me to turn and run, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was behind that door. The tapping started again, this time louder, more frantic, as if whatever was behind the door was trying to break through. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my pulse pounding in my ears. I reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shock of ice through my fingers. With a deep breath, I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols I couldn't understand. The air in the room was thick with something ancient, something sinister. My heart thudded in my chest as my eyes scanned the room, landing on the center of the floor. There, lying in the center of the room, was an old, weathered book. Its cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age, but it was the symbols on the cover that made my stomach drop. They were the same symbols that had been etched into the walls. I couldn't look away. I felt drawn to it, as though the book were calling to me. I bent down, reaching out with trembling hands to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact with the cover, a violent gust of wind blew through the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I jerked back, my heart racing as the room grew colder, the shadows twisting unnaturally around me. The lamp flickered and dimmed, casting everything in a sickly, pale light. Then the whispers began. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, just a rustle, like the sound of wind passing through the cracks in the walls. But soon, It grew louder, more insistent. It was a chorus of voices, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder still, until it felt like they were inside my head, swirling around my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing down on me, holding me in place. The book opened on its own, the pages flipping rapidly as if some unseen force were searching for something. The whispers intensified, and I could hear one word clearly now. Release. The ground beneath me shook. The walls trembled. A low, guttural rumble echoed from deep within the lighthouse, reverberating through the floor and into my bones. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel something in the air, something alive, watching me from the shadows. I turned to run, but the door wouldn't open. It was as if the room itself had sealed me inside. I pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows danced around me, warping into shapes I couldn't comprehend. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The air was thick with something ancient and malevolent. And then, from the darkness, I saw it. A figure, a shape, emerging from the corner of the room. It was tall, its features obscured by the shadows. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring every moment. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its eyes. The air grew colder still, and the whispers grew frantic, as though the figure were feeding on the terror it was creating. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. The figure stepped forward, its form now clearer. It was cloaked in darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood, but I could see the outline of its hands, pale and skeletal, long fingers reaching out toward me. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter, and I could hear the figure's voice now, low and raspy. Release or suffer. My blood ran cold. I had no idea what it wanted, what it meant, but the terror was suffocating, overwhelming. I could feel my mind fracturing, slipping away as the room spun around me. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't escape. My body refused to obey, paralyzed by a fear so overwhelming, so ancient, that it felt as if my very soul were being drained. The cold grew more intense, sinking deep into my bones, and the whispers, the same word, release, continued to echo in my head, louder now, demanding, pleading. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, I forced my legs to move, stumbling backward away from the figure. I couldn't think, couldn't reason, only act on pure instinct. My hand found the doorknob, and for a fleeting moment, I thought the door might open, that I might be able to run, away from whatever nightmare this place had become. But then the world seemed to freeze. The air around me grew thicker, heavier, as though the very fabric of reality had been stretched too thin. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, rumbling growl that reverberated through the walls, the floor, and my chest. I turned to face the door, willing it to open. But nothing happened. The figure didn't move. It was as though time itself had been suspended. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing, searching for any way out, any way to break free. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the tension snapped. The air cleared. The growling stopped. The figure was gone. The room was silent. I gasped for breath, my body trembling, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might shatter my ribs. I was alone in the room once more, the oil lamp flickering weakly in the corner. The book lay open on the floor where I had dropped it, its pages now still. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air. Something had been released. Something had shifted. I didn't know how long I stood there, trapped in a fugue of fear and confusion, unable to make sense of what had just happened. The events that had unfolded over the past few days, no, weeks, had been a blur, a spiral of terror that had led me to this moment. I had come to the lighthouse seeking solitude, peace, and quiet, but what I had found was far from any of that. I reached for the book, my hand trembling as I carefully closed it, not wanting to disturb whatever dark power had once been contained within. I needed to leave. I had to get out of this place before whatever had been released found its way back to me. But I wasn't sure if it was too late. I grabbed the flashlight again, my mind racing with the realization that I couldn't stay any longer. I couldn't remain in this place, not knowing what had been set free, not knowing what the figure had wanted from me. I couldn't bear the thought of staying here any longer, waiting for the darkness to return and consume me whole. I ran to the door. This time, it opened. It was as though the lighthouse had decided to let me go, to release me from its grasp. The cold night air greeted me like a slap in the face as I stumbled out of the cellar and into the open. I didn't stop running. I couldn't stop running. I ran up the winding path that led back to the main road, my feet pounding against the earth, my breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town, breathless and shaking, that I finally stopped. I collapsed into the first inn I found, barely able to explain what had happened. I didn't even know if anyone would believe me, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be away from the lighthouse, away from that island, away from whatever darkness had been unleashed. The innkeeper didn't seem particularly concerned by my appearance. He gave me a room and a hot meal, though his eyes occasionally flicked to the window as if something were watching from outside. But I didn't care about that. I was too exhausted, too shaken to worry about anything but the overwhelming urge to sleep. I collapsed onto the bed, the sound of the innkeeper's footsteps fading into the distance as I drifted into unconsciousness. But even as I closed my eyes, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still following me, that something had followed me from the lighthouse. The nightmares returned that night, nightmares of the figure in the cellar, of the whispers in the walls, of the cold, unrelenting darkness. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, heart racing. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was safe now. But the unease never quite left. Days passed, and I left the town as soon as I could. I didn't stay long enough to get to know anyone, to form any connections. The dread had crept too deep into my soul. I knew I couldn't stay there, couldn't linger in the place where the memory of the lighthouse would haunt me at every turn. I tried to put the experience behind me, to forget it. But even now, as I sit here, writing these words, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The shadows in the corners of my room seem to flicker, twisting in ways they shouldn't. The whispers, faint but insistent, still echo in the back of my mind, always just out of reach. I've tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it's all in my head. But there's something about the lighthouse, something about that place, that won't let me go. And so, I find myself wondering, was I truly freed from whatever dark force resided there? Or is it merely biding its time, waiting for the right moment to return, to reclaim what was once its prison? I can't say for certain. But one thing is clear, I will never set foot on that island again. Months passed since I fled from the lighthouse, and life, for the most part, resumed its ordinary pace. The nightmares, though vivid and terrifying, eventually began to fade. I returned to my job, I reconnected with friends, and I moved forward, trying to ignore the constant feeling that something from the past was still clinging to me, hidden just below the surface of my everyday life. The air had changed, though, ever since my return. There was a weight to it, something oppressive that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I couldn't look at the sea the same way, couldn't walk along the shoreline without feeling the pull of something deep beneath its surface, calling me, waiting. The lighthouse had become a distant memory, one I tried to bury, but the thoughts lingered, haunting me on quiet nights when the wind howled in the dark, the moon hanging low and ominous over the horizon. One day, as I was sitting at my desk, trying to push through a day's work, I received an email. It was from an address I didn't recognize, an official-looking one that came with an urgent tone. At first, I thought it was just junk, some advertisement or automated message. But then I saw the subject line, the lighthouse. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment I hesitated. Something about that simple phrase twisted my insides. I opened the email. Dear Sir, We are writing to inform you that your recent visit to the lighthouse has been documented. We would appreciate your immediate cooperation to clarify your presence there, as strange occurrences have been reported since your departure. The local authorities are aware, but we are conducting a private investigation. Please contact us at your earliest convenience. Regards, the Lighthouse Foundation. My hand trembled as I read the message. The words blurred in front of me as panic set in. What strange occurrences? Had others felt the same sense of terror I had? I had never shared my experience with anyone, not in detail, not the figure, the whispers, the overwhelming cold that had gripped me in that cellar. Yet here I was, being contacted by someone who seemed to know more than they should. I had tried to leave it all behind. I had tried to put it in the past. But there it was, knocking at my door once more. A cold dread settled over me, but something in the back of my mind, some small flicker of resolve, told me to respond. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps a deep-seated need to finally understand what had happened to me. So, I replied. I was there. What's going on? The reply came swiftly, almost too swiftly. We'll need to meet in person. There's something you need to know. Can you make it to the island tomorrow? Please come alone. I froze. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to say no, to ignore the invitation, to turn away from this nightmare that I had tried so desperately to escape. But a part of me, an unsettling, dark part, was drawn to it. The answer I had longed for, the truth behind everything that had happened to me, could finally be within reach. I couldn't resist. The next morning, I found myself standing on the dock, staring at the old boat that would take me back to the island. The fog was thick that day, rolling in from the sea like a wall of white, and the air had the same eerie chill I remembered from my time at the lighthouse. As the boat pulled away from the shore, I glanced back at the mainland, the world I knew, fading into the distance. The island seemed far less inviting now. It felt like a place of judgment, not solitude. The journey was silent. The boat rocked gently with the waves, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the fog. There were no birds, no sounds of life, just the rhythmic splash of water against the boat's hull. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. There was something else on this boat with me, something just out of sight, lurking beneath the surface. When the boat finally docked, I stepped off, heart pounding in my chest. The lighthouse stood at the top of the hill, its silhouette barely visible through the haze. I didn't know what awaited me there, but I felt the pull again, the same pull that had brought me here the first time. The meeting was arranged inside the lighthouse itself, near the base of the tower, where a small, dimly lit room awaited. I walked inside, my footsteps heavy, echoing off the stone walls. The room was sparsely furnished, a desk, some chairs, a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. And at the desk sat a man, middle-aged, his face worn, his eyes tired but sharp. "You're here," he said simply. There was no welcome, no preamble, just a statement of fact. "I am," I replied, swallowing hard. "What's this all about? What's going on with this place? What happened to me?" He motioned for me to sit. "You were the last person to experience it, the last person to leave the lighthouse before everything began. Something was unleashed there, something ancient, something that we were trying to contain." He paused, as though deciding how much to share. The lighthouse was built on a site of great significance, spiritual significance. It was once a place of power, a place that drew in energy from the very fabric of the earth. Over the years, people tried to harness that power. They failed. I felt a lump form in my throat. What exactly was it that failed? What is it that's still here? The man leaned in. The entity that resides within this place, it's not just a haunting. It's a prison. And when you open that door, you unwittingly set it free. His words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, my vision going blurry. "No, it's not possible." "But it is," he said softly. "And we've been monitoring it ever since. It's not gone, you see. It's still here. And we need to keep it contained." But we can't do it alone. That's why you're here. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. But I knew, deep down, that I was part of something much bigger, something that I could never escape. I walked away from that meeting without ever truly feeling like I left. The island, the lighthouse, and the entity within, it was all a part of me now. I would never be the same again. The island's pull had found me once more. It all started during the summer of 2013. I had just turned 26 and decided to take a long road trip across the country. I had been working non-stop for the past 2 years, and I knew I needed a break. The idea of leaving everything behind for a while seemed like a perfect opportunity to reset. It was meant to be a simple, carefree adventure. I'm not the kind of person who gets spooked easily. Ghost stories never really bothered me. I'd heard enough of them, laughed them off, and continued about my life. But this trip changed my perspective entirely. The journey was supposed to be a solo experience. I wanted to get to know myself better, clear my head, and see places I'd only heard about on the news or seen in pictures. The plan was to drive down the coast, stopping at whatever hotel looked interesting, and spending a few days in each town. But what I didn't account for was what was waiting for me when I checked into the Kingswood Inn. The Kingswood was an old hotel, standing proudly on a quiet street in the middle of nowhere. It had a faded charm to it, with its tall windows and stone facade. I could tell it had been around for decades. There was something undeniably alluring about it. It wasn't particularly fancy, but that's what made it intriguing to me. It felt like a piece of history. I walked into the lobby that night, a little after dark, tired from a full day of driving. The air was thick with that musty hotel smell. You know the one, like old carpets and wood that hadn't been aired out in years. The lobby was small, almost too quiet. A reception desk sat in the corner with a tired-looking man behind it, scribbling something in a notebook. He looked up when I entered, giving me a tired smile. "Evening," he greeted. "You here for a room?" "Yeah," I replied. "Just for one night." His gaze lingered on me a little longer than necessary, but he didn't say anything. I couldn't quite place it, but there was something about him that seemed off. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, or the way he didn't move his hands too much. I chalked it up to the long day and walked over to the counter. "Room 212 is available," he finally said, handing me a key. It was an old-fashioned brass key, not the modern plastic ones I was used to. The kind of key I'd expect to see in a hotel from a different time. I took it without a word, gave him a nod, and made my way up the creaky staircase to my room. The hallway was dark and narrow. The dim light from the overhead fixtures didn't help much, casting long shadows along the walls. As I walked down the corridor, the place had this eerie, abandoned feel. The kind of place you might see in a horror movie, but I dismissed those thoughts right away. I was here for a night of rest, not to get caught up in some spooky atmosphere. I reached room 212, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was small, but it had everything I needed. A bed, a desk, a window that looked out onto the darkened street below. The wallpaper was peeling in some spots, and there was a slight mustiness to the air, but nothing out of the ordinary. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, relieved to finally relax after the long drive. But even as I settled into the room, I felt something was off. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't anything specific. It was more like a heavy presence in the air. A quiet hum that seemed to surround me, pressing down on me in a way that didn't feel natural. I shook it off, turned on the TV, and tried to focus on something to take my mind off the strange feeling. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake it. As the hours passed, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. It wasn't just the dark corners of the room or the feeling of eyes on the back of my neck. It was more than that. The air itself felt alive, as though the walls were breathing, shifting with each passing moment. I didn't want to let my mind wander too far, so I pushed the thoughts away. After all, it was just a hotel. It was just a room. I had no reason to be afraid. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. And then, in the middle of the night, it happened. Something I'll never forget. I had been in the room for hours, trying to wind down and fall asleep, but something about the place wouldn't let me rest. The quiet hum I had felt earlier persisted, like the room was vibrating ever so slightly. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was the old building settling, maybe the wind outside pushing against the windows. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Eventually, I managed to drift off, though my sleep wasn't peaceful. I woke up several times throughout the night, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving me. Each time, I'd roll over, check the clock, and force myself to close my eyes again. But it wasn't until around 3 a.m. that the first sign of something truly strange occurred. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach when I heard it. The softest thud, almost like something had fallen to the floor in the hallway. At first, I dismissed it. It was probably the wind, or maybe someone else staying in the hotel was moving around. But then the thud came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking in the hallway outside my room. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The steps grew louder, each one deliberate and heavy, as if whoever was walking was taking their time. I glanced at the clock. 3:14 a.m. I had to remind myself that I was alone in the hotel, that the man at the desk downstairs had given me the key without anyone else around. I couldn't imagine there was anyone else here at this hour. The steps continued, moving past my door and then stopping. Just stopping, as if the person had frozen in place right outside. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't one to get scared easily, but in that moment, a chill ran through me. I stood up, slowly making my way to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but something inside me hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if it was just my mind playing tricks on me? But then the steps began again, this time retreating back down the hall. I didn't think. I didn't question. I opened the door quickly, peering into the dimly lit hallway. There was no one there. The air was thick, like the atmosphere had changed while I wasn't paying attention. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I made my way down the narrow corridor. Every door was closed, silent. I walked to the end of the hall and turned the corner, finding nothing but empty space. I stood there for a moment, confused and unnerved. What had I just heard? Who was walking around at this time of night? And why hadn't I seen anyone? The hotel had seemed abandoned when I arrived, but now it felt like I wasn't alone. That feeling of being watched returned, but this time it was stronger, almost suffocating. I returned to my room, closing the door behind me. I didn't want to admit it, but I was rattled. The footsteps weren't the only strange thing about the situation. As I stood there in the hallway, I had noticed something odd. The air wasn't just heavy, it felt thick, like there was a pressure in the atmosphere that hadn't been there earlier. I tried to put it out of my mind, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts kept racing. Was it just my imagination? Maybe I was overtired, my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of driving. But then again, that thud, those footsteps, sounded too real. I glanced around the room, checking everything once more. The furniture was where it had been when I entered. The bed, the desk, the dresser, all in their places. I turned off the light, thinking I could finally get some rest. But just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard it again. A low, almost imperceptible scraping sound coming from the corner of the room. I shot upright, my pulse racing. There was no wind, no reason for the sound to be there. The scraping continued, soft and rhythmic. It sounded like something, or someone, was dragging their fingers slowly along the wall. I blinked, convinced I was hearing things, but the sound didn't stop. It was real. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the covers off and jumped out of bed, flicking the lights back on. The sound stopped immediately, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner. But there was nothing. No one. The walls, however, looked different somehow. They didn't look any more worn, but the feeling in the room had shifted. It was as if the atmosphere itself had changed. The temperature had dropped several degrees, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. I stood frozen, my thoughts racing. Was I losing it? Or was something in this hotel messing with my mind? I stood by the window for a while, trying to calm myself down. The street outside was completely still. The only sound was the distant hum of a car passing on the road. I tried to focus on anything else, but the image of that empty hallway, those footsteps, and the strange noises wouldn't leave my mind. I needed to sleep. I had to. I was exhausted. I lay back down, this time pulling the covers tightly around me, as if that would somehow protect me from whatever was lurking in the hotel. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound, every shift in the room had me on edge. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was off. This hotel, the atmosphere, the silence, none of it felt normal. Finally, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. A knock. 3 soft, deliberate knocks on the door. I froze. Who could it be? The man at the front desk? No one else should have been here, at least not at this hour. I sat there, unable to move, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 quick raps, as if someone was impatient. The tension in the air grew unbearable. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. I had no choice. I had to open the door. I had to see who was on the other side. The knocks hadn't stopped. 3 more, each louder than the last, echoing through the silent room. I stared at the door, feeling my heartbeat hammer in my chest. My mind raced with questions. Who could it be? Was it some prank? A late-night guest trying to mess with me? Or was something more sinister at play? I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Every part of me screamed not to, yet the curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me towards it. I reluctantly slid out of bed and tiptoed toward the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. My breath felt shallow, my throat tight with fear. The knocks came again, sharp and insistent. My hand hovered over the doorknob. I wanted to just bolt for the exit, get out of that room and away from this madness. But I had to know what was happening. I slowly turned the knob and pulled the door open. Nothing. There was no one standing in the hallway. The only thing that greeted me was the soft glow of the dim lights overhead and the emptiness stretching down the corridor. But as I peered out into the dark hallway, I noticed something else. A faint smear of dust trailing across the floor from one end of the corridor to the other. It looked like footprints, but they weren't the usual kind. These seemed smeared, like someone had dragged their feet, slowly and deliberately. My heart sank. Who was in the hallway? What were these marks? And why had no one else heard the knocks? I stepped into the hallway, glancing both ways. The atmosphere felt colder now, the air thick with a heaviness I couldn't explain. I followed the marks, my footsteps echoing on the old wooden floorboards. The hotel seemed deserted, silent, as if even the walls were holding their breath. As I walked down the hall, I passed the other rooms. They were all quiet, but something about them felt off. The doors were all shut tight, yet there was a strange, almost oppressive energy pressing against the walls. I shivered, feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched, even though there was no one around. The further I went down the hall, the more the sense of unease grew. The dust on the floor became thicker, the marks more pronounced. They led me to the last door at the end of the corridor, room 203. It was the only door in the hotel that was ajar. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled to push the door open. It creaked loudly, breaking the stillness of the night. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from the narrow crack in the door. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse racing, but I forced myself inside. The room was empty, just like all the others. The bed was neatly made, the chairs tucked in by the table, but something wasn't right. The air inside felt oppressive, as if it had been sealed off for years. I could barely breathe, the air so thick and stale. It smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. The window was shut tight, the curtains drawn. But it was what I saw on the floor that made my stomach drop. A dark stain spread across the carpet, like a large, irregular puddle of ink. My first thought was that it was some kind of spill, but the longer I looked at it, the more it didn't make sense. The stain was too concentrated. It wasn't from anything natural. I stepped back, my mind racing. What was this? I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, standing motionless in the far corner of the room. I froze. The figure was tall, dressed in what looked like an old, faded suit, but I couldn't make out any more details. It was too dark, too far away. The moment I turned to face it, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, vanishing like smoke. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. What had I just seen? Had I imagined it? I rushed out of the room, my heart pounding, my head spinning with confusion. When I returned to my own room, the oppressive atmosphere didn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just out of reach, watching, waiting. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming. The strange footsteps, the knocking, the dark stain on the floor. I couldn't make sense of it. Was I losing my mind, or was there something truly wrong with this place? As I sat back on the edge of the bed, trying to gather my thoughts, I heard something again. This time, it was louder, unmistakable. A soft tapping sound, almost like fingernails tapping against the wall. I turned toward the source of the sound, my heart in my throat. It was coming from the corner of the room, the same corner where the figure had stood earlier. I stared at the spot, my eyes straining to see. The tapping grew more intense, faster, as if whatever it was getting closer. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and walked toward the corner. My hand reached out to touch the wall, but as soon as I made contact, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. I pulled my hand back, breathing heavily, my eyes darting around the room. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones, This sense of dread, this overwhelming urge to get out, to escape before whatever it was took hold of me too. But just as I turned to head for the door, I heard it, another knock. Louder this time. Closer. Right behind me. My blood ran cold as I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, still, yet the presence of something else in the air was undeniable. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for the door handle. What had happened? Was I just imagining all of this? Or had something darker truly entered the hotel? I didn't have time to find out. The door opened and I ran. I bolted down the hallway, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from that room, that hotel, that suffocating atmosphere. But as I reached the stairwell, I heard it again, the faint scraping sound. The same as before, soft and steady. It was coming from the room I had just fled. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't alone. I ran. My feet pounded against the cold, hard floors of the hotel. My breath ragged, panic spreading through my veins like wildfire. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there, away from the oppressive atmosphere, away from the knocking, away from whatever had been haunting me. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape it. The sound of scraping grew louder with every step I took, like something was dragging itself across the floor behind me, following me, pursuing me relentlessly. I rounded a corner, my heart in my throat, and found myself at the hotel lobby. The front door was in sight, but it seemed miles away. The once comforting hum of the old lights now felt like a mocking reminder of how alone I was. There was no one else in sight, no staff, no guests, just the vast emptiness stretching out before me. I rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. But when I touched it, I felt a strange, cold resistance. The door wouldn't open. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest, but the door remained stubbornly shut. It was as if something invisible was holding it closed, keeping me inside. I turned back, desperately searching for another way out, but before I could react, the air in the lobby grew thick. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I glanced around, my eyes darting across the empty space. That's when I saw it. Standing near the far wall, where the hallway met the main lobby, was a figure. Tall, cloaked in darkness, with no distinct features. It was just a silhouette, a shadow of a person. But there was something about it that made my blood run cold. Something that made every instinct in my body scream to run, to hide, to do anything to escape. But I couldn't move. The figure seemed to grow taller, its form becoming more solid, more real with each passing second. I tried to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. I could feel the coldness radiating from the figure, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my bones, freezing me in place. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to move. It didn't walk, it glided, sliding across the floor as if it were floating just above the ground. My eyes followed its movements, my heart hammering in my chest. The scraping sound returned, now deafening, louder than ever. It was coming from the figure, from its very presence, as if the floor itself were being torn apart by its movements. I wanted to turn away, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of the figure. It was drawing closer, and I could feel its presence, like a shadow wrapping around me, pressing in from all sides. The air grew even colder. My breath became visible in front of me, fogging up the air with each exhale. The scraping noise grew louder, more frantic. My mind was spinning, and I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. Was this real? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real. It was here, in this hotel, in this space, and it was coming for me. The figure reached the center of the lobby, just a few feet away from where I stood frozen. And then, with a jolt, it stopped. For a moment, everything went silent. The scraping ceased, the temperature seemed to stabilize, and the figure stood there, motionless, just staring at me with its empty eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I could barely breathe. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a whisper. It was more like a low, guttural hum, something that vibrated in my chest, in my very bones. The words were indecipherable, but they carried an unbearable weight, an ancient, malevolent force that pressed against my skull. The hum grew louder, more insistent. I could feel my head pounding, my vision blurring, as if the very sound of its voice was tearing me apart from the inside. My pulse raced in my ears, and I thought I was going to pass out, but just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure stopped moving again. The hum faded. The coldness lifted. And in that moment, the room seemed to grow deathly still. It was as if time had stopped altogether. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. Then, without a word, it turned and started moving toward the far wall, fading into the shadows as if it had never existed at all. I stood there in the dead silence, my chest heaving with each breath. My heart was pounding in my ears, my mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. I felt sick, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the encounter. I didn't know how long I stood there. It felt like hours. My legs were stiff, my body still shaking from the adrenaline. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had just happened, whatever I had just seen, I couldn't explain it. The figure, whatever it was, had shown itself. It had revealed its presence in the most terrifying way possible, and now it was gone. But the fear remained. My body was trembling, soaked in sweat, yet I felt frozen in time. The once quiet hotel lobby, now a place of terror, felt even more desolate, its corners shadowed by an unseen presence. That thing, the figure, whatever it was, had left, but the feeling it left behind was far from gone. It clung to the air, to the walls, to the very ground beneath my feet. I wanted to run. I wanted to flee this place, never to return. But I couldn't move. My legs were stiff, unwilling to obey my mind's frantic commands. I stood there, struggling to breathe, my pulse thumping in my chest like a war drum. What had just happened? What had I witnessed? The questions surged in my mind, crashing over me like waves in a storm, but the answers were nowhere to be found. It was like the figure had never truly been real, as if it were a hallucination or a trick of the mind. But no, there had been too much. The sound of the scraping, the bone-chilling cold, the sensation of something watching me, following me, it was all too real. I had to get out of there. I had to leave, and fast. Somehow, my legs started to obey me, moving, albeit shakily, toward the front door. I reached for the handle again, this time with more force, but it still wouldn't budge. My mind raced, and I pulled harder, desperate to escape. But the door remained sealed, as though an invisible force had locked it in place. The panic surged again, thick and overwhelming. I turned around, looking for anything, any other way out, but the lobby seemed to stretch on forever. There were no other exits, no windows, only the door, the one that wouldn't open. My head was spinning. My breath came in ragged gasps, the walls of the hotel closing in around me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to turn to. For a moment, I just stood there, paralyzed, staring at the door that refused to open. And then I heard it. A low, faint sound, like the tapping of fingers against the floor. It wasn't coming from outside, though. It wasn't even coming from behind me. No, this sound, it was coming from somewhere in the room. I looked around frantically, my eyes darting to every corner of the lobby. But there was nothing. Nothing but the dark, silent air. I felt it then, the presence, that invisible weight, like a shadow hovering just behind me. My blood ran cold and my stomach twisted. It was back. The figure was back. I could feel it, lurking in the silence, waiting, watching me. The sound of the tapping grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a faint tapping anymore. It was deliberate. slow. Each tap was like a heartbeat, a pulse, getting closer and closer to me. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my throat, but there was still nothing. The lobby was empty. The silence was deafening, but the tapping didn't stop. It was then that I saw it, an old elevator door, hidden in the corner of the lobby. I hadn't noticed it before. It was small, rusty, and barely noticeable, but there it was. I hadn't heard it open, but I knew it had to be the source of the noise. The elevator. Before I could stop myself, I was moving toward it, drawn to it as if by some unseen force. My feet moved faster than I could think, and in a matter of seconds, I was standing in front of the elevator, my hand hovering over the worn brass buttons. The tapping stopped. A sudden, unnatural stillness filled the air. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to thicken, and I could feel the weight of whatever had been watching me pressing down harder. I hesitated, my hand trembling as it hovered over the button, but I couldn't back down now. I had to know. I had to see what was behind this. I pressed the button. The elevator door creaked open, slowly, reluctantly, as if the building itself was hesitant to reveal what lay inside. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, but when the door fully opened, I wasn't ready for what I saw. There, inside the dimly lit elevator, was a small, flickering light. It cast eerie shadows across the walls, and there was something else. Something that made my stomach lurch. The walls of the elevator were covered in scratches, deep, jagged gashes that looked like they had been made by claws, or worse, something far more terrifying. And in the center of the floor, there was a pool of something dark and sticky. Blood. I stepped back, my breath coming faster now, panic setting in as I realized just how close I was to something truly horrifying. I had to get out of there. I had to leave before it was too late. I turned to run, but as soon as my foot hit the ground, the elevator door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. My heart leapt into my throat, and I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it didn't open. The elevator groaned, a horrible sound like metal scraping against metal, and then it began to move. It descended, slowly, almost lazily, as if the building itself were dragging me down into the depths. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The elevator stopped. The doors slid open again, and I stumbled out into what I can only describe as a nightmare. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the flickering light overhead. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural coldness that chilled me to my core. And the floor was slick with something wet, something that glistened in the faint light. The blood. I looked around, my body trembling with fear, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It was watching me. The terror that gripped me was suffocating, paralyzing. I could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was waiting, watching, and I knew deep down that I had to do something. Anything to survive. I turned to run, but the moment I moved, the figure stepped forward. A flash of motion so quick, so unexpected, and then it was there, standing in front of me, its presence overwhelming. The last thing I heard before everything went black was a voice, a low, guttural whisper, just inches from my ear. You should never have come here. I woke up, though I wasn't sure where I was. My head throbbed, the pain sharp and pulsing like a constant reminder that something terrible had happened. My vision blurred as I tried to sit up, and for a few moments, I thought I was still dreaming, trapped in some nightmare I couldn't escape. But the sensation of the cold floor beneath me, the eerie silence around me, told me that this was all too real. I was no longer in the hotel lobby or the elevator. In fact, I couldn't recognize the place I was in. The room was small, cramped, and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb overhead. The walls were old and cracked, covered with layers of grime and dust. The air was thick, heavy with a damp, musty odor that made it hard to breathe. I tried to stand, my body weak and disoriented, but as soon as I moved, the sharp pain in my head returned. I gritted my teeth, trying to push through it, but everything felt so surreal. How had I gotten here? What had happened? I couldn't piece it together. My memory was hazy, and the events from earlier, those terrifying moments in the hotel, felt like they belonged to someone else, not me. Then it hit me, the voice, the figure, the elevator. I stood up abruptly, a jolt of panic running through me, but my legs gave way. I collapsed back to the floor, clutching my head, trying to steady my breath. My mind raced. Had it all been real? Was I trapped in some sort of nightmare? Was I alone? Or had I somehow crossed into another reality, one where the laws of the living no longer applied? The cold sweat on my skin reminded me that this was not a dream. I was awake. I was here. But where was here? I dragged myself to the wall, leaning against it for support, and that's when I saw it, etched into the cracked plaster, the faint outline of words. Scratched so deep into the surface that they looked like they'd been carved with something sharp, like nails or claws. Get out. I stared at the words for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just a warning. It was a command. A command from something that knew I was here, something that wanted me to leave before it was too late. But there was nowhere to go. The room was sealed off, no windows, no doors. I was trapped. The fear that had gripped me earlier surged back, stronger this time, more intense. I had to get out. I had to find a way. But no matter how hard I looked, no matter how desperately I searched for an exit, I couldn't find one. It was as if the room itself was designed to hold me in, to keep me confined until whatever had brought me here was ready to finish its work. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed. I pounded my fists against the walls, shouting for help, for anything. But there was no response, no sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence that seemed to surround me, pressing in from all sides. I sank to the floor again, my body shaking uncontrollably, the reality of my situation settling in. I was completely alone, and whatever had happened to me, whatever had taken place in that cursed hotel, was far from over. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time felt irrelevant in that place. I couldn't keep track of it anymore. My body ached from the cold and exhaustion, but still, I couldn't find a way out. Every time I thought I saw an opening, a crack in the walls, it would vanish just as quickly as it appeared. Then, in the distance, I heard a low, echoing sound, like footsteps. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, and I could feel the air around me shift, heavy with the presence of something, or someone, approaching. I didn't know if I should be relieved or terrified, but I had to see. I had to know if it was real. I staggered to my feet, pushing myself forward, despite the dizziness and the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I turned a corner and found myself standing in front of another door. This one was different. It was large, wooden, and old, but it looked real, solid, as though it had been there for years. My heart raced in my chest as I reached for the doorknob. It was cold, slick with something that made my fingers slip. But with one final effort, I turned it, and the door creaked open. I stepped into a dark hallway. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked beneath my feet. It was just like a hotel, a place that was abandoned, forgotten. But this felt different. It felt as though the hotel had been waiting for me to find it again. And that's when I realized I wasn't just trying to escape. I had been brought here for a reason. The figure, the whispers, the blood, they were all part of something bigger. Something that had been happening for years, for decades, maybe even longer. I wasn't the first one. I wouldn't be the last. I didn't want to go deeper into the hallway, but I knew that it was the only choice I had left. So I walked forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Each step took me further away from what I thought was reality, closer to something far darker, more insidious. And as I walked, I felt it again, the presence, the heavy weight of something watching, following. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, its walls pulsating with some malevolent force. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, just beyond the reach of my vision. The hallway stretched on forever, but I knew I was getting closer to the heart of it, to whatever had caused this nightmare, to the answers I didn't want to find. Finally, I stopped. Ahead of me, in the distance, a door stood ajar. It was as if it were waiting for me to open it. I could feel the pull, a force drawing me toward it. My body didn't want to move, but my mind was compelled, as if this was the last step I had to take. The final decision. I stepped forward. And then, just as my hand touched the door, the hotel faded from view. The hallway, the walls, the presence, it all disappeared, like sand slipping through my fingers. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was that voice again, a whisper in the back of my mind. You're not alone. It was a few years ago when I first heard about the old lighthouse that stood at the edge of the coastline. Nestled on the farthest tip of the island, it had always been a place of fascination and dread for the locals. I had heard plenty of stories, rumors, and whispers about the place, but they all seemed like things you'd hear in passing or read in local legends, nothing that seemed all too real. But that all changed one fateful summer. I had just wrapped up a long stretch of work, stressful, exhausting, and demanding, like any other day in my life. My friends and I, in need of some time away from the chaos, decided to take a short trip to a quiet, secluded spot, a place that was far from the distractions of city life. The idea was simple, just a few days of relaxation. Nothing too wild, nothing too out of the ordinary. I didn't expect much. Just a break from everything. We found a little cottage near the coast, not far from the lighthouse, and thought it would be the perfect spot to recharge. There were 4 of us, had known each other for years. I'd grown up with 2 of them, and the third had become a close friend over the last few years. Together, we made up a small, tight-knit group, the kind of friends you could count on for anything. This trip was meant to be about bonding, exploring the outdoors, and perhaps a bit of sightseeing. The lighthouse, I thought, would be an interesting landmark to visit, but I didn't imagine it would hold any special significance for our getaway. The first few hours at the cottage were exactly what you'd expect. We unpacked, settled in, and even made a quick trip into the nearest town for provisions. The sun was shining, and the weather was perfect. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, like we were in the middle of nowhere, away from the noise of the world. As the evening approached, we decided to walk down to the lighthouse, partly out of curiosity, partly because we had nothing else to do. The lighthouse stood tall against the horizon, its white stone weathered by years of salt, wind, and time. The light at the top, though no longer functioning, still had an imposing presence. It was easy to see how, for years, it had been a guiding beacon for ships trying to navigate the coastline. Now, though, it looked abandoned, forgotten, its purpose long gone. We made our way to the base, where the building was crumbling, surrounded by overgrown vegetation. The steps leading up to the tower were cracked and uneven, and the rusted door, once a barrier to the elements, hung loosely on its hinges. We didn't spend much time there at first. The lighthouse, while eerie, didn't seem all that unusual. The air was salty, the wind a bit stronger near the water, but there was nothing that screamed danger. Still, as I stood there, something about the place felt off. It wasn't the lighthouse itself. It was more the quietness of the surrounding area, the way everything seemed a little too still, like time had stopped in this corner of the world. That night, we gathered around the small fireplace in the cottage, chatting, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. But as the evening wore on and the shadows stretched out, I noticed something strange, a sense of unease creeping into the air. It wasn't obvious at first, just a subtle discomfort that seemed to grow with each passing hour. I tried to brush it off. We were in an old cottage after all. It was just the creaking of the floorboards, the occasional groan of the building settling. But as the wind howled outside, there was a persistent sense that we weren't truly alone. None of us spoke much about it that night, but as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling. There was something about the lighthouse, something I couldn't explain, that made my skin crawl. I tried to push it out of my mind and sleep, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though the world around me had changed. The peaceful quiet of the day had turned into a thick, oppressive stillness, as though everything around me was holding its breath. It wasn't until the following day that the first unsettling thing happened, something small at first, but enough to make me question whether there was more to this place than I had originally thought. I'll get to that soon, but for now, I'll just leave you with this. I wasn't ready for what we were about to face. The morning after our first visit to the lighthouse, I woke up with a lingering sense of unease. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to shake the feeling, and the air inside the cottage seemed thicker, heavier than it had the day before. I tried to brush it off as nothing more than an overactive imagination, fueled by the dark, solitary night. But something inside me told me that it wasn't that simple. The others, however, were in good spirits. We had planned a casual walk to the beach that morning, intending to enjoy the fresh air and maybe take a few pictures. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, one without any distractions or weird feelings. But as soon as we stepped outside, I noticed something strange. The lighthouse was now far more distant than it had seemed the evening before. We had walked there the night before, and it had felt close, like we could almost reach out and touch it. But now, it seemed to loom farther away, almost as if it had somehow shifted overnight. I didn't mention this to the others, though. I knew how ridiculous it sounded. A lighthouse doesn't just move. But still, the more I looked at it, the more it felt wrong. The air around it felt different too, thicker, as though the wind wasn't moving the way it should have. I tried to focus on the walk, on the sound of our footsteps crunching against the gravel path, and the waves crashing softly in the distance. But my thoughts kept drifting back to that lighthouse. Was I just overthinking things, or was there something more going on? Maybe it was the isolation, the strange, unsettling quiet. Perhaps I just wasn't used to being in such an isolated place. We reached the beach, and I was glad to be out of earshot of the lighthouse for a while. We settled down on the sand, talking about nothing in particular, enjoying the simple pleasure of being away from the noise of everyday life. It wasn't until about an hour later that we decided to walk along the shoreline, heading toward a small rocky outcrop where the waves crashed harder against the rocks. I was bringing up the rear when it happened. I noticed a shadow near the base of the lighthouse, something that wasn't there before. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a trick of my mind, but it was too specific, too deliberate. It wasn't like the shadows cast by the sun or the trees. This one was sharp and defined, and it seemed to stretch unnaturally. The lighthouse's tall structure blocked the sun at just the right angle, making it hard to discern what was causing it. But for a brief moment, I could have sworn it looked like someone, or something, was standing by the door at the base of the tower, watching us. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off it, but when I tried to speak up, my voice caught in my throat. The others were ahead, chatting, oblivious to what I was seeing. When I blinked and refocused, the shadow was gone. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I had misjudged the light. The others were already moving further along the beach, their voices carrying back to me. I turned to follow them, shaking my head, trying to push the bizarre image out of my mind. But it lingered, the feeling of someone, or something, watching us from the lighthouse, too vivid to ignore. We continued on, and I tried to act normal, but I could tell that I was acting off. I couldn't bring myself to tell the others what I'd seen. It didn't make sense, and it was easier to just dismiss it as a trick of the light or a hallucination brought on by the isolation. That night, we gathered in the cottage again, and after dinner, we sat in front of the fireplace, our casual conversation winding down. As we talked, I noticed a faint smell in the air, a strange, almost metallic scent that made my stomach churn. At first, I thought it was just the old fireplace, the wood we had burned earlier. But the smell lingered, stronger now, more distinct. It wasn't something that should have been in the air of the cottage. I tried to ignore it, but the others started noticing it too. "What is that smell?" one of my friends asked, scrunching up his nose. "Yeah," another chimed in. "I noticed it earlier. It's like something's burning." We all agreed it wasn't just the fireplace. The smell was different, almost like rust or decaying metal. The kind of smell you'd associate with something unnatural. We checked the cottage, thinking maybe something was wrong with the chimney or an old pipe that had somehow sprung a leak. But everything was fine. The smell seemed to be coming from the direction of the lighthouse. The air around the cottage felt thick, dense, and I could almost taste the metallic tang on my tongue. The unease we had been brushing aside earlier now bubbled to the surface. I looked around at the others, their faces reflecting the same discomfort that had settled deep in my chest. There was an unspoken understanding in the room. We weren't imagining this. Something was wrong. The air outside felt heavier as we went to bed that night. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize the events of the day. My mind kept circling back to the shadow it seen near the lighthouse. Could it have been a person, someone living nearby? But no one had mentioned seeing anyone else. And why had the lighthouse felt so far away in the morning? I got up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, and wandered to the window. It was pitch black outside. The only sounds were the faint crashing of the waves and the occasional creaking of the cottage as it settled. I stared out toward the lighthouse, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving near the base, just beyond the reach of the fading moonlight. I squinted, trying to focus, but before I could even make sense of it, the shape disappeared, leaving only the dark silhouette of the lighthouse against the night sky. I pulled the curtains shut and returned to bed, my mind racing. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my heart hammering against my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, or that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right, that the air around us had changed in a way that I couldn't explain. The next day, the others didn't seem to be as bothered by the odd occurrences. They were more focused on exploring the island, and it was easy to let the strange events slip from my mind as we went about our day. But for me, the unease lingered, hovering in the back of my thoughts, constantly reminding me that something was watching. Something was waiting. That afternoon, we decided to venture out to the lighthouse again, hoping the fresh air would help clear my head. But as we got closer, I couldn't shake the sense that something was waiting for us, something darker than just an abandoned tower. The wind picked up, and the once calming sound of the waves seemed distorted, as if they were somehow off-key, as though nature itself had begun to misbehave. And that's when the real trouble started. As the days passed, it became harder to ignore the growing unease. At first, it was just small things, small enough that I could convince myself I was overthinking it. But then the events started coming one after another, relentless and impossible to dismiss. The cottage, which had once felt like a peaceful retreat, began to feel more like a cage. The air grew heavier with each passing day, the stillness of the island pressing in on us like a weight we couldn't escape. The others had started to notice it too. We would gather for meals and exchange uneasy glances when the silence became too oppressive, when the creaking of the floorboards beneath us or the way the wind howled outside seemed too deliberate, as though the house itself was trying to communicate something. But nobody wanted to say it out loud. We all knew that if we named the fear, it would somehow make it real. The most unsettling change came on the fourth night. We had spent the day hiking along the cliffs, exploring the rocky coastline, hoping the exercise would take our minds off the constant tension. As we walked, I could feel the eyes of the lighthouse on us from afar, its towering presence always in the background, no matter where we went. It was as if it had become a part of the landscape itself, a fixture that couldn't be avoided, even though we never went near it anymore. That night, I went to bed early. My nerves were shot, and I needed some rest to clear my head. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. I kept hearing the faint sound of footsteps, a soft scuffing noise that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the cottage. It wasn't enough to be fully alarming, but it was enough to make me pause, to strain my ears to listen for more. The sound never came again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. The next morning, I found my friend standing by the window, staring out into the distance with a look of confusion on his face. "You all right?" I asked, my voice hoarse from a restless night. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the lighthouse in the distance. I followed his eyes, but the lighthouse looked the same as always, solid, unmoving, silent. "I saw something," he muttered finally, his voice tight. "Just a shape near the door. I thought it was one of you messing around, but it wasn't." I froze, my heart pounding. I hadn't mentioned the shadow he'd seen by the lighthouse, thinking I was just imagining it. But now, it seemed like the same thing had happened to him. "We should go check it out," I suggested, though I wasn't sure I wanted to. Despite the unease hanging between us, we gathered the group and set off towards the lighthouse. As we walked, the air grew colder, the sky darkening faster than it should have. It was as though the day was shrinking, the time slipping away faster than usual. We reached the base of the lighthouse, its towering presence more imposing up close. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, as though someone or something had been there recently. One of us reached for the handle, but something stopped them. There was a chill in the air now, a sharpness to the wind that bit at our skin. The faint metallic scent from before returned, stronger now, almost overwhelming. We all stood there, staring at the door, a heavy silence stretching between us. None of us made a move. "What do we do?" someone finally asked, their voice tight with fear. "We should go inside," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. But I knew that was exactly what we had to do. We needed to find out what was happening, why we all felt so on edge. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, the sound of old wood protest under our touch. The interior was dark, even though the light outside was still fading into the evening. There was a dampness in the air, a musty, decaying smell that made my stomach churn. I stepped inside first, the others following closely behind, their footsteps echoing on the old stone floor. The walls were covered in grime, the air thick with the smell of mildew. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and there were signs of decay everywhere, furniture in disrepair, the remnants of what had once been a working structure now abandoned. We moved cautiously, our eyes scanning the dimly lit space, each of us half expecting something to jump out at us. The only sound was the distant crashing of the waves against the rocks below. The deeper we ventured inside, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. "I don't like this," one of my friends said, his voice trembling. We should leave, but we couldn't. Not yet. We needed answers. The feeling of something watching us was becoming unbearable, and I was sure the others could feel it too. The air felt thick, almost electric, and I could sense their fear growing with every step. We reached the bottom of the spiral staircase that led to the top of the lighthouse. The faint scent of decay was stronger here, and the temperature dropped even further. The stairs creaked under our weight, the sound sharp and unnatural in the otherwise silent space. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we climbed, each step carrying us closer to whatever it was that had made this place feel so wrong. At the top of the stairs, we reached the lantern room. The glass was clouded with grime, but through the layers of dirt, I could make out the surrounding landscape, dark, empty, and desolate. But there was something in the distance, something that made my breath catch. It wasn't the land or the water, it was the sky, swirling in unnatural patterns. It looked as if the very air was twisting, moving, and folding in on itself. I could almost hear it, the hum of something hidden just beyond the edges of perception. "We need to go," one of my friends whispered, backing away slowly, his eyes wide with terror. But before anyone could respond, a loud crash came from below, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, the same scuffing sound he had heard in the night. We turned and rushed back down the stairs, our panic rising with every step. The doors slammed shut behind us as we scrambled out into the cold, open air, gasping for breath. As we stood outside the lighthouse, trying to process what had just happened, I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on us again. The metallic smell lingered, the silence of the island now deafening. The lighthouse, once a structure of curiosity, now stood like a silent sentinel, watching us from the distance. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's wrong. That place, it's not just abandoned, it's alive." But it wasn't just the lighthouse anymore. It was the entire island, the air, the land, the very atmosphere that felt alive with something else. Something dark, something ancient. We weren't alone here, and we hadn't been since the moment we stepped foot on the island. As we turned to leave, I could have sworn I saw movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow flickering in the distance, just beyond the lighthouse. But when I looked again, it was gone. The fear in all of us was now palpable, thick in the air, as we hurried back to the cottage. We had no answers, no explanation for what had happened, but one thing was clear: there was something on this island that didn't want us here. And we had just scratched the surface of something far more sinister than we could have imagined. We all agreed that we would leave the next morning, but as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the island wasn't going to let us go that easily. Something was waiting for us, just beyond the edge of the lighthouse. Something ancient, something that had been here long before we arrived, and would remain long after we left. The night stretched on, filled with the sound of the waves and the creaking of the cottage, as if the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The morning after our visit to the lighthouse, none of us could sleep. We lay in our beds, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind whipping outside the cottage. The island was alive with a strange energy, as if it was waiting for something, holding its breath until we made our next move. None of us spoke of what happened in the lighthouse. It felt like a shared secret that no one was ready to confront, let alone acknowledge. But the terror that had taken root in all of us was undeniable. We all knew something was out there, something we had disturbed by venturing too close. By noon, we had gathered in the living room, each of us looking at the others with a mixture of fear and disbelief. No one dared to voice the one thought that haunted us all. Was it too late to leave? Was the island already claiming us, making us part of its dark history? "We can't just leave," one of my friends said quietly. His voice trembled, betraying his own fear. "We've come this far. We need answers." I didn't know what to say. I could feel the weight of his words, but I also felt a growing sense of dread that churned in my gut, pushing me to leave, to run. But something else held me there. It wasn't just a desire for answers. It was the feeling that we were part of something larger now, something we couldn't escape, even if we tried. The island had already marked us. We had no plan, no real strategy. We only knew that we couldn't stay cooped up inside anymore. We had to confront whatever was happening, no matter how terrifying the idea seemed. We decided to return to the lighthouse, but this time we wouldn't just explore the ground floor. We were going to go all the way up to the lantern room, where we had seen the swirling sky the night before. We had to understand what was going on, even if it meant confronting the very thing that had been tormenting us. The walk to the lighthouse was eerily quiet. The wind had died down, leaving the island shrouded in a suffocating stillness. The trees along the path stood motionless, their branches heavy with the weight of the silence. It felt as though the whole island was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. We moved as one, our footsteps too loud on the soft ground, breaking the unnatural calm that had settled over us. As we reached the base of the lighthouse, I noticed that something had changed. The door was wide open now, far wider than it had been the day before. It wasn't just ajar, it was inviting us in. And I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at it, knowing that crossing that threshold meant we were committing ourselves to something we couldn't undo. I turned to the others. They were all just as nervous as I was, but there was something else in their eyes too, determination. They had come this far, and they weren't about to turn back now. We entered the lighthouse, the door groaning on its hinges as it swung open. The air inside was thick with dust, and the familiar musty smell of decay was stronger than ever. The coldness was sharper too, like the chill of a forgotten tomb. The same suffocating atmosphere that had gripped us the day before hung heavily in the air. We climbed the spiral staircase once more, our footsteps reverberating off the stone walls. Each step felt like an eternity, the silence growing deeper with each ascent. As we neared the top, I could feel the tension mounting, the atmosphere thickening until it felt like we were walking through a dense fog, a fog that seemed to swallow everything in its path. When we finally reached the lantern room, the sight that greeted us was enough to make my blood run cold. The swirling sky was no longer a distant anomaly. It was here, in front of us, tangible and close, as though the very fabric of reality had started to unravel. The air around us shimmered, rippling with an unnatural energy, the sky above twisting and folding in on itself. There was a hum now, a deep, vibrating sound that filled the space, vibrating through my bones, making my heart race in terror. But it wasn't just the sky that was wrong. It was everything. The lantern, which should have been a glowing beacon of light, was dark, its glass cracked and broken. Shadows danced in the corners of the room, flickering like they were alive, their forms shifting and changing in ways that didn't make sense. I could see them moving, gliding along the walls, as if they were searching for something or someone. "We need to leave," one of my friends whispered, his voice shaking with panic. But it was too late. The door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang, cutting off any hope of escape. The walls trembled, and the hum grew louder, resonating deep within my chest. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and grow, pooling around us like a rising tide. I turned to face the others, but their faces were frozen in terror, their eyes wide, fixed on something I couldn't see. Then I saw it. A figure, standing at the far side of the room, just beyond the reach of the swirling sky. It was tall, almost impossibly so, its form indistinct, as though it were made of the same shifting shadows that filled the room. Its face, if it even had one, was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its presence, feel its cold gaze upon us. It was watching us, studying us, and I knew without a doubt that it was not human. I took a step back, my legs shaking beneath me, but I couldn't look away. The figure's presence was suffocating, pressing in on me, choking the air from my lungs. The hum was deafening now, filling my head with a high-pitched ringing, making my thoughts scatter and fade into the darkness. Suddenly, the figure moved. It wasn't a step or a lunge. It was more like it simply shifted, its form gliding across the room in a blur of darkness. The room seemed to distort around it, warping as it drew closer. The shadows twisted and writhed as though they were alive, bending and curling to its will. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost in the hum, swallowed by the oppressive energy that filled the space. I turned to the others, but they were frozen, trapped in the same terror I felt. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, and they couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as though the figure had paralyzed them, bound them in place with its presence. And then I felt it. a sharp, icy sensation at the back of my neck, like fingers brushing against my skin. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the figure, standing directly in front of me now, its form taller than ever. I could feel its cold breath on my face, though it had no mouth to speak of, no eyes to see. It was nothing but shadow and darkness, but it was here, and it was real. In that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just afraid of it. I was afraid of what it represented. This wasn't some wandering spirit or ancient curse. This was something older, something that had been here long before any of us, and it was watching us, waiting for us to make our move. But before I could make sense of it, the air around us seemed to snap, a violent force shaking the entire room. The shadows recoiled, and the hum intensified until it was deafening, drowning out everything else. I thought my head might explode from the pressure, my vision blurring, and my body convulsing as though I was being pulled apart from the inside. And then, silence. It was as if the world had simply ceased to exist. The hum was gone, the shadows no longer writhed. The figure, the island, the lighthouse, everything was still, as if nothing had happened at all. We stood there, trembling, unable to speak, unable to move. We had no idea how much time had passed. The only thing that remained was the cold, the oppressive silence, and the realization that the island had marked us. And now, we were its. We had no way out. The figure had gone, but its presence lingered, like a shadow that could never be cast away. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, motionless, our minds racing, but unable to grasp the full scope of what had just happened. The figure, the shadows, the unearthly hum, it was all too much to process, too much to even begin to understand. What had we encountered? Was it a ghost, an entity, or something even darker, older, and more malevolent than we could ever have imagined? My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as if the island itself was urging us to leave. We didn't speak. We couldn't. Our bodies were frozen, unable to move, unable to do anything other than stand there in the oppressive quiet that followed the disturbance. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite name, an unspoken dread that weighed us down, making every breath a struggle. It felt like the lighthouse was alive, the walls pressing in on us, the floor groaning beneath our feet. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, to escape this cursed place and never look back. But there was something holding me there, something powerful and unseen. The others looked just as terrified, their eyes wide with fear, their faces pale from the shock of the encounter. They didn't know what to do either. Finally, it was one of them who broke the silence. His voice was barely a whisper, trembling with the same terror we all shared. "We need to get out of here. We're not safe." The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with the truth we had all been too afraid to acknowledge. We were never safe here. We had ventured too far into the unknown, too deep into the island's secrets, and now it felt like we were trapped. The figure, whatever it was, had made its presence known, and we had no way of knowing if it would ever leave. Without saying another word, we moved toward the door, our footsteps tentative, cautious, as if any sound might provoke something, anything, from the shadows that still seemed to linger in the corners of the room. The door swung open with an eerie creak, and we stepped out into the cold, the bitter wind slamming into us like a wall of ice. The relief was immediate, but it was fleeting. We had left the lighthouse, but we hadn't escaped the island. We hadn't escaped whatever darkness had awakened within it. The walk back to the cottage was filled with tension. None of us spoke, too afraid of what might happen if we acknowledged what had occurred. The island felt different now, darker, as if it were watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. The path that had seemed so familiar just days ago now felt like a treacherous maze, the trees pressing in on us, the shadows growing longer with each step. It was as though we were being herded, pushed towards something we couldn't see but knew was there, just beyond the reach of the dimming daylight. When we finally reached the cottage, the door closed behind us with a soft thud, but it didn't feel like safety. There was no sense of security, no comfort in the familiar. Instead, there was only the gnawing feeling that the island wasn't done with us. It had let us leave the lighthouse, but it had no intention of letting us go. We tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The events of the day replayed in my mind over and over, each time more vivid, more terrifying. The figure in the lighthouse, the way it had watched us, studied us, it felt like it had been waiting for something. Had we unknowingly disturbed it? Was it angry? Or was it something else entirely? We had no answers, no way of knowing. And that was what terrified me most. The uncertainty. The feeling that whatever had happened wasn't over yet. That we were merely waiting for the next part of the nightmare to unfold. We spent the next day in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, too afraid to speak about what had happened. We had come here to escape, to experience something new, something different. But now, it felt like the island had chosen us, marked us in a way we didn't fully understand. The weight of that knowledge hung over us, a constant reminder that we were not in control. By the evening, the air had grown heavy with a strange, electric tension. The wind had picked up again, howling outside the cottage, its mournful cry echoing through the trees. The night felt thicker, as though the darkness had deepened, settling around us like a blanket. We tried to keep busy, to ignore the creeping fear that was slowly consuming us, but it was impossible. It was in every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows. The island was alive, and we were trapped within it. As night fell, we gathered around the fireplace, too afraid to be in separate rooms. We spoke in hushed tones, though none of us really had anything to say. We had no answers, no explanation for what we had seen, and it felt like the questions only piled up the more we tried to make sense of it. The figure in the lighthouse. The strange hum that had vibrated through the air. The shadows that had moved of their own accord. None of it made sense. And then, as the night grew darker still, the door to the cottage slammed open, the wind howling through the cracks, sending a chill down my spine. My heart stopped for a moment, and I saw the same fear reflected in the eyes of my friends. We hadn't opened the door. No one had. I moved cautiously toward the door, my breath visible in the air, though it wasn't cold inside. The wind had stopped, but the door remained ajar, as though someone or something had pushed it open. I stepped outside, my feet heavy on the ground, as if the very earth beneath me was unwilling to let me go. The world outside was still, almost unnaturally so. The moon was high in the sky, casting a ghostly light over the landscape. But there was something different about the air tonight. It was thick, dense, and full of a strange energy, the kind you feel before a storm, before something unexplainable happens. And then I saw it. The lighthouse, standing in the distance, its dark silhouette against the night sky. But it was no longer just a structure. The sky above it was alive again, swirling in a pattern that made my stomach churn. The shadows that had once been contained within the lighthouse now stretched out, seeping into the surrounding landscape, curling around the trees, the rocks, and the earth beneath our feet. I felt the others gather behind me, but no one spoke. We all saw it. We all knew. The island had not let us go. It had only allowed us to leave the lighthouse, to think we had escaped. But we hadn't. It was still there, waiting. The next morning, we left. We packed our bags, gathered our things, and without a single word exchanged, we walked away from the cottage, from the lighthouse, from the island that had claimed us. None of us looked back. But as the ferry pulled away from the dock, as we left the island behind, I felt it. The weight of the island's presence, pressing in on me even as we sailed away. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The lighthouse, its towering presence and dark silhouette against the horizon, haunts me. I can still picture it, even now, clear as day. The way the shadows inside seemed to shift and move as if the walls themselves were alive. The way the air felt electric and heavy, vibrating with a sound that could barely be heard but was felt deep in my bones. The figure, if that's what it was, watching us from the threshold, its unseen gaze fixed upon us as if waiting for something. I don't know what it wanted, what it hoped to achieve by showing itself to us. But I know this. The island has a power that we'll never fully understand, and it's something that, once touched, never truly lets you go. I still see the faces of my companions in my mind, the fear in their eyes, their silent understanding of what we had stumbled upon. We didn't speak much after we left. There was nothing to say. What words could we use to explain the inexplicable? How could we describe the sheer terror that gripped us, the way the world felt as if it had shifted beneath our feet? We had no answers, only more questions, each one more unsettling than the last. We never returned to the lighthouse, and I don't think any of us ever will. There's a sense of finality in that decision, a recognition that some places are meant to be left undisturbed. The lighthouse had shown us a glimpse of something dark and ancient, something that had been waiting long before we ever set foot on that cursed island. And now that it had made its presence known, I wasn't sure we could ever truly leave. Perhaps that's the price for curiosity. Once you look into the abyss doesn't just look back, it reaches out, touches you, and doesn't let go. There are still nights when I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something is watching me, that the island is still out there, still waiting. The world doesn't feel as safe as it used to. I can't shake the thought that whatever force haunted that lighthouse might have followed us, might have crossed the water and found its way into the very fabric of our lives. And then there are the dreams. They're always the same, dark, suffocating, full of shadows that seem to shift and move when I'm not looking. I find myself back at the lighthouse, standing in that cold, oppressive silence, with the same unearthly hum vibrating through the air. I can't move, I can't escape. And that figure, that presence, it's always there, watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge it, to understand it, to confront it. But I can never speak. The words don't come, and I am left frozen, trapped in that moment forever. I've tried to move on. I've tried to forget, to bury the memories of the island deep inside, to push them aside as nothing more than a bad experience, a figment of my overactive imagination. But no matter how much I try, I can't shake the feeling that it's still there, lurking just beyond the edge of my perception, waiting to drag me back. The others, too, have gone on with their lives. They've tried to return to normalcy, to put the island behind them, but I know it hasn't left them either. We all carry the weight of that experience, each of us holding our own silent fear, our own private terror. None of us speaks of it, not directly, at least. But there's a shared understanding, an unspoken agreement that we don't need to talk about it. The island, the lighthouse, the shadows, it's all still there, lingering in the back of our minds, waiting for us to acknowledge it again. Sometimes, when I pass by the ocean, when the waves crash against the shore, I can't help but look out toward the horizon, toward the place where the island lies hidden beneath the vast expanse of water. I wonder if anyone else has ventured there, if anyone else has come across the same dark secrets we did. I wonder if there are others who have felt the same pull, the same irresistible draw to the island. Or maybe we were the last ones. Maybe the island only chooses a few at a time, only reveals itself to the most curious, the most reckless. But then I remember the feeling of being watched, the feeling that there is something out there, something older and more powerful than we can comprehend. And I know that the island isn't done with us. It's never done. Maybe one day I'll return. Maybe one day the pull will be too strong and they'll have to face it again. But for now, I try to live with the knowledge that whatever we encountered there, whatever force haunted that lighthouse, will always be a part of me. I'll never forget the island, and it'll never forget the lighthouse. Sometimes I think that's the price we pay for curiosity. Some things are better left unseen, and some places are never meant to be discovered.